Allora, incominciamo. Oggi parleremo, tu parli in italiano, sì. Un po' misto, italiano, italo-americano, italiano, italiano, inglese, o anche cinese se vuoi. And we're going to have to treat this, it's a small group, so we're going to treat this as a seminar. And anyone who wants to intervene during the dibattito later on, I think there's some other people who are going to join us in the course of the morning. Ornello Rossi probably might come back, and Guido Cappelli said he was going to come back. So we will just, fra di noi, have a little conversation about il nostro. Allora, so our first speaker this morning is Xinghao Wang, who is currently in Athens and is a graduate of Chicago, the University of Chicago, a man of many languages and many talents, who by curious routes that led many of us to, various curious routes have led many of us to Patrizi, and his route is even more unusual. But I'm hoping that he will maybe join our Patrizi project team at some point. We'll see. And so he has been working on Patrizi, and he will speak to us this morning about Patrizi and Greek constitutional thought. As among his many accomplishments, aside from Greek and spoken Latin, and 5 or 6 other languages, he has been working in Athens on constitutional thought and Aristotle. So he will do for us an analysis of Patrizi's constitutional thought in the luce di antiquità. Okay, so please, Xinghao.
Yeah, thank you for the generous introduction. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we start? And I think I'm going to essentially, I think I'm trying to frame Patrizi in terms of his reception of Greek thought and use that as a case study to theorize reception and reading more generally. Okay, so I'm just framing it in terms of here, these 2 ways of reception of Greek Greek thought, and I'm following Prof. Tankin's framing of this, which is that there's essentially 2 waves, and first would be in the High Middle Ages, where we get these translations of the ethics, Nicomachean ethics, and the politics. These are not of especially high quality, they're not very complete, and this influenced what I would call these first wave thinkers from, the central figure really is Aquinas, so then his teacher, Albert the Great, and his student, Giles, and so on. And I'm taking this work from Giles being Aegidius Romanus, Egidio Romano. Yeah, so I'm taking Giles's De Regimine Principum as this Muriel princess, which was wildly popular in its day, and I think Giles was considered a seminal commentator on Aristotle. And in contrast, we have the second wave of humanist translations, and here I take Patrizi's De Regno as the representative work. I think this is a pretty decent comparison because they both are in this genre of mirrors of princes, and I also do take De Regno as his mature Patrizi, and I think his Greek did get better over time. So I think this would sort of him at his most Greek. Okay. And this is an argument with a very complicated thesis, which I will just read out. So Patrizi is representative of the second wave in the reception of Greek constitutional thought in 15th century Italy. A mature understanding of Greek constitutional thought is achieved in this second wave, as evidenced in Patrizi's subsumption of rule of law under virtue politics, especially under justice and practical wisdom. Patrizi is hence closer to ancient Greek and late Byzantine thinkers, like Aristotle and Nikephoros the Medists, than he is to first wave thinkers like Giles of Rome. And I will attempt to do this analysis through how they understand legal justice as described in book 5, first chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics. Okay, so just a brief background about Greek virtue politics, and obviously it's a long span from ancient Athenian to late Byzantine, but I will just focus front and yet back. But generally, because my larger project is to theorize virtue politics in its most general sense, and I do think it is a default mode in which people think of politics in pre-modernity. I define virtue politics slightly different here. I know in the Renaissance it's defined in terms of legitimacy, but I am defining it here as emphasizing personal character as opposed to impersonal institutions. And I do this because I'm also looking at work in East Asia and South Asia, and I think there's this very useful distinction made by Kim Song-moon for East Asia, where he says there are moral virtues and there are political virtues, and different theorists would disagree on how much the moral virtues and political virtues are aligned. And so, in my view, even someone who's completely amoral, or a theorist who says moral virtues are not important, but political virtues are, I think it is still a mode of virtue politics, even if it's maybe more ironic, a more ironic use of the term virtue. Yeah. And I think it is so prevalent because it's a very intuitive way to think about politics, because I think as people, we just tend to emphasize personal factors rather than situational factors. Okay, and we start from ancient Athenian virtue politics, and this is even before Plato and Aristotle. There's this great piece by Ryan Ballard who talks about just the political culture of democratic Athens, and by looking at the ideology expressed in the oratory, I think primarily by Demosthenes, he finds that political success is conceived primarily in terms of political virtues, and these virtues take on this very reflective, judgmental character, which stereotypically Athenian. And skipping all the way to the late Byzantine, we also have this person, Nikephoros Lemnides. So as you may know, Constantinople was sacked in 1204 by the Crusaders. So they did that instead of actually crusading, but it caused a lot of trouble. But you see, so that would be when Lemnides was 7, and then they had to move to another region. And generally in such times of turmoil, you see more reflection about what went wrong, how can we fix things, and people tend to look back to the past. And so he becomes this quite influential figure who was also a teacher to the future emperor. And so here you see his formulation of how law relates to virtue. So even though he speaks about, can people see? Should I read it out? Okay. Where he talks about legislation, adjudication, but you see this is actually different from what we think of as law today, because just the way he frames it is the philosopher, he legislates, but he legislates, for the city, for the home, for the student, and for himself. So clearly these are not laws in the legal system. It's something different, it's another notion of law here. And I think it really goes back to Aristotle's conception of law. Here, he does not really have a systematic legal theory, but rather it's just it's an achievement of the practical rationality of the legislator. So it's this setting of rules that is very much centered around the excellence of the legislator. I think Lemnides is very much drawing on this. And so broadly, there is some sort of continuity in this tendency. Okay, and I also want to point out that there is a certain tension between Aristotle's view of nomos, of law, where there is a universal content, but also is particular to different regimes. And I think the slight tension here between the universality and the particularity can be quite helpful in understanding the differences between the two waves. Okay, so looking at the first wave of reception with Giles, I'm looking at this Derivine Principum, this Mirror of Princes, and here he's analyzing this section of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 1. And he says, okay, there's two kinds of justice: legal justice, equitable justice. And Aristotle does in fact say that legal justice is the whole of virtue and is very closely related to law. But the question is, what is this close relation? What is more important ultimately? And and then there's this part, which we will see later in Patrizi as well. And so I do want to focus on this last passage here, on this paragraph. Therefore, law universally commands to fulfill every virtue and avoid every vice. Therefore, legal justice, that is, the fulfillment of the law, is in some sense the whole of virtue. Equitable justice, on the other hand, is a specific virtue through which what is fair, that is, what is rightfully owed, is rendered to each person. And I think, so I was translating Universalität as universally, and I think in this conception, he very much, he does not have this sense of the lawmaker using his practical rationality to create the laws. It does not have this sense of contingency and space for error. And so this is very much a natural law conception, which makes sense because he's a student of Aquinas. Okay, and so I think, so this is the passage that he's analyzing. And I think it's because Giles is approaching the text with a certain lens that he neglects the contingent, possibly erroneous aspect, which is why I think there is this little line at the back where it says, the law orders some things and forbids others, correctly if established correctly, less well if done so carelessly. So I think Aristotle would say, so it depends on how good the lawmaker is. Whereas I think Giles would read this as saying, you should follow the universal laws that have already been laid out. Now, does that make sense? So Giles has this more trusting attitude towards the law. And you can see this because Giles, he doesn't have the complete text of the politics, but he says that he thinks that if he had it, he would find laws that would regulate even specific contracts. So he thinks there's this hyper-developed body of law that is already in that thought, and which is why he would read it as the error is not in the law itself, but people perhaps in enforcing the law or understanding the law. And so the primacy, the center is in this law, this body of law as an institution. Okay, and then we'll look at the second wave, which has Patrizi's Eero as a representative. And so he's looking at a similar passage. So what does he talks about this? So there's natural justice and there's legal justice. And then he cites quite a few different sources. So whereas you see Giles, he was citing Nicomachean Ethics, but also Magna Moralia, which is an Aristotelian work, meaning it's not by Aristotle, but we now think it's not by Aristotle, but someone who was in Aristotle's school. But Giles is drawing from that Aristotelian tradition, whereas Patrizi here, he's drawing from this Asconius Pedianus, commentator on Cicero, and so it's drawing from a Latin tradition. And then here, he says that, and here the first paragraph, you would think this is a very pro-law position, because it says, all things that originate from the laws are to be considered just, for they ought to be established according to some virtue. And then he has the same discussion as in Giles, just about how a soldier, or how certain laws relate to certain virtues. So here, they seem to track pretty well. But then, and then here, I think it's quite interesting. He even cites a jurist. And here, I think you can see a bit of the interpretive lens coloring his reading, because he's citing this jurist where he says that justice is the constant and perpetual will to render to each person the due right. Indeed, this appears to encompass disposition and character, so character being habitus, and especially when he adds that the precepts of law are these: to live honorably, not to harm another, and to render to each their due right. So it seems to me there's nothing about virtue in this. And so it's very striking that he would actually read this passage as in terms of virtue instead of in terms of law. Okay. And yeah, and so then we have this classic idea that the judge is a living law. And so now we have a very Aristotelian Aristotelian conception of the lawmaker, where the authority of the law really comes from the excellence of the lawgiver, as opposed to the body of laws themselves. So we have the reversal here because where Giles was taking all the Aristotelian words, he's not really giving an Aristotelian interpretation. Whereas here, Patrizi, he's taking Roman legal words, but he's giving it this Greek virtue politics interpretation. So I think it's very, very striking, to me at least. And I think it's really telling about the interpretive position that they're approaching the text with. Yeah. And then he concludes the whole section. Therefore, one must conclude once again that justice, the greatest of goods, can never be labeled as folly, which is the opposite of wisdom. Nor can it ever be separated from innocence, the most illustrious of all virtues, since it is virtue itself and the singular good of people, and encompasses together within it all goods and all virtues. So, very clear statement. So again, both Giles and Patrizi agree that law and virtue are very important. But Giles would say, yeah, you have virtue, but what you really need is the law. And then Patrizi would say, yeah, you have the law, but what you really need is the virtue. So I think this is a very striking difference when they're reading the same passage. And and then I think I kind of had this other section if you wanted to talk about reception, but I'm not sure about the time. But I could just go through this pretty quickly. Anyway, so I'll just do the quick one because I thought this was very interesting in theorizing reception because as you know, reception in the Renaissance has so many layers. There's clearly Greek and Latin traditions interacted in antiquity, and then you have the whole transmission through the Byzantines and then to the Islamic world and then back. So many different layers. And then there's a Christian dimension as well. Whereas for this case of Chinese Buddhism, it's very straightforward. It's just Buddhism in India, Silk Road, China. So I think it's a very elegant case study. And it's also about metaphysics, which I think it's, because it's so abstract, it's less prone to distortions. Whereas politics, I mean, even your Uber driver has an opinion on politics, right? But he doesn't care about metaphysics. So I think in being so abstract, it's very nice to see the fingerprints of the reception going on here. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just speak a bit about this. Essentially, so this is my timeline of reception of Buddhism in China. And really, Buddhism enters China through the Silk Road. And this Madhyamaka school, formed in the 150 CE, it enters China around the 4th century, and I think it becomes fully Sinicized, made fully Chinese by the 6th century. This is my timeline here. And I also include this part about Zhuangzi, which is a Taoist text which forms its own school of interpretation, because the reception of Buddhism is heavily mediated through Taoist interpretive categories. And this is why so the main character of the reception would be the Tiantai, which I think is a fusion of Buddhist and Taoist ideas, but in a very seamless, organic way. Okay, and so in the two sources, I would say there's Indian Buddhist school, Madhyamaka, and then there's the Chinese Taoist text here. And the Madhyamaka metaphysics is anti-foundationalist, and all things like independent existence because they're all deeply causally intermeshed. Whereas the Taoist text emphasizes what I think is the strong perspectivism, which basically combines where it says, where the Indian side would say, okay, anything depends on many other things. And then the Taoists would say, well, one of the things they depend on is perspective. And so therefore you get this, I think, very seamless fusion in this 6th century. And a similar case of the different readings in different languages, which you can see in the Sanskrit here. Essentially, the Indian schools, they would say there are only two truths. Well, I don't want to explain what those truths are, because it's a long time, but just difference between 2 and 3. Okay, so the Indians would say there's only 2, and you can see from the here, because this relative pronoun is a feminine one, which would only refer to this sunyatam in the first line. And so it comes out very clearly that there's only 2 truths. Whereas in the Chinese, it introduces certain ambiguities because it's unclear what the subject is pointing to, the reference is pointing to. And so they end up interpreting it as 3. So why do I talk about all this? Just to go back to Patrizi, which is what we're here for, I think I want to emphasize 2 strategies of reception and transformation that we can see both in the Patrizi case as well as in this Chinese case. First, I call this choosing the center, where because most intellectual traditions, I think, they have this variety of elements that are in conflict, they conflict or are in tension. And so the choice to prioritize one element over the other, or the choice of prioritizing one element or the other, can generate opposing views that are both grounded in the tradition. I think you see this in the Giles and Patrizi example. So they are both drawing on the text. I think they are both pretty faithfully reproducing the text, trying to understand it, but just as a very subtle interpretive choice really changes whether you're more legalistic or you're virtue politics. And secondly, just especially for translated text, it does introduce certain ambiguities which can be exploited, consciously or not, to support less plausible interpretations. And I think I would want to add one more point, which is also just the availability of the text. So as you may remember, Giles, he did not really have the full corpus, the full Aristotelian corpus. And I think he also lacks a lot of the surrounding context with which to understand what Aristotle is trying to say. And so I think in both cases, so I think you also have to add in this, just the availability of the text, because I think especially political thought, it has to be understood within a larger context, because it's so deeply embedded in the historical situations. Yeah, and this last part, these interpreters are presumably all sincere. I think they are ultimately shaped by the hermeneutic apparatus, or the something about Gadamer, yeah. And so, but more generally, I want to say that these are general mechanisms for how traditions can change and grow. And all interpreters have a hermeneutic apparatus that shapes their interpretation. And so at some point, I think we can make a judgment as to whether these are legitimate developments or not. And I want to say that Patrizi is a legitimate development of Greek constitutional thought, built on a mature understanding of Greek ideas on their own terms. Yeah, and some future directions, I think just this Myriads of Princes might be a very productive genre to theorize virtue politics. And also virtue politics might be a very useful framework to excavate non-explicit political theorizing in certain genres. And also, another idea I want to throw out is that there are different theoretical tendencies in Greek versus Latin. So Greek, again, more virtue politics, Latin, more legalistic. And lastly, suggestion that maybe Chinese Buddhism might be very useful or interesting, even if your main interest is Western classical reception. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you.
This is extremely interesting to me. I've been trying to, over the last few years, create a dialogue between Confucian philosophers who actually invented the term virtue politics and Western students of meritocracy. We had a couple of conferences sponsored by Harvard in 2018, but our collaboration was shut down by the COVID. But we still have a group going on doing this. I thought that I had invented the term virtue politics when I published the book in 2019 of that title. But in fact, I later discovered that it had been used once by Ryan Ballot, who you mentioned, but just in passing. But that the Chinese have had this term, the degli, right, the virtue politics, and it means, I guess, virtue rule of some kind. because the Chinese don't really do politics in our sense. But anyway, so what I very much appreciate about this talk is the effort to bring in the Buddhist tradition as well, which I don't think really has been done. So Hao is doing really very cutting edge stuff and has the languages to do it, unlike many people who do comparative studies. He must know Sanskrit pretty well, I suppose. You're working on it. You're working on it, okay, you're working on it. But so it's difficult to have Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, and classical Chinese. So being from Singapore, you are in the middle of that cultural world that covers all those zones. And so he's in a unique position to do these comparative things. I think you're exactly right about the difference between Giles Fromm and Patrizi, and Patrizi is in a sense more Aristotelian because he understands the nature of Aristotelian practical wisdom. So Aristotelian practical wisdom, well, what happens in the Middle Ages with people like Giles of Rome, they're not willing to think of prudential reasoning as a posteriori reasoning. In other words, gathering together examples of virtuous conduct and coming up with rules that can change. The Christian tradition in general is completely committed to the idea of natural law, which is in the human soul, to which we have direct access. And this is a consequence of St. Paul's teaching in the Romans that one has to, in order to condemn the pagans for their wrongs and for them to be aware that they were committing sins, they have to have an inner consciousness of what sin is. This is, and in other words, part of the dynamics of Christian faith involves pagans being able to understand that they're doing wrong. And that requires inner knowledge of the law, right? Everyone knows the law, whether they're pagan, Christian, Jewish, doesn't matter. Everyone has the law inside. This is deeply un-Aristotelian, okay? Or you could. It's not Aristotle's approach. So throughout the Middle Ages, you have this doctrine of synderesis, which assumes that anyone can make a moral judgment and has a direct link to the divine law in some way. And Patrizi is more authentically Aristotelian because his approach is, as I say, a posteriori, where you form prudential judgments based on perhaps a generalized knowledge of what is right, but not any kind of propositional knowledge of what a law would be. So I've had this discussion with Gabriele Pedula for some time. By the way, Gabriele Pedula, I wish he could have been here. I invited him, of course, to speak. He is, I think, someone who knows Patrizi and the Trattatistica tradition very well, and has written very important things on Patrizi. But he just got a new job. He's working at the Scuola Romale. He just was translated from Roma Tre to the Scuola Romale, and they have their examinations in these 3 days. So he had to be there. But he sends us his greetings and good wishes, and he hopes to interact with Patrizi scholars in the future. I guess when you get a new job at the Scuola Romale, you have to show up for your first set of exams. In any case, I've had this discussion with Gabriele for a long time, because he sees Patrizi as an Aristotelian, straightforward Aristotelian, and my idea is that Patrizi is anything but an Aristotelian, at least in terms of sources, because Patrizi was commissioned by Pius II to bring together all the fruits of the translation movement of the early 15th century, which includes Greek history, Greek literature, philosophy, and poetry, and he was supposed to cull all of this new material, newly translated from Greek into Latin, and to bring it to bear on the problems of government, especially the problems of Republican government, because both Piccolomini and Patrizi were both Sienese, and they were critical of current Sienese government, and they thought that they could use the classical tradition to correct the Sienese tradition of republicanism, although that's not what they say, of course, in the preface. The preface they say, you Sienese have nothing to learn about republics. We're just going to give you a little bit of classical knowledge. But what the real intention is to reform Sienese government, and through Siena, other governments in the West. So anyway, so my position is that, at least in terms of fontes, Patrizi is trying to bring in all these other sources and integrate them with an Aristotelian. He does not ignore Aristotle. When I worked on this book, I discovered that there was a lot of silent Aristotelianism in Patrizi, where he cites an obvious Aristotelian doctrine, like doctrine of the mean or the doctrine of the politeia. And he almost is quoting Aristotle's definition, but he doesn't mention Aristotle. So I think there's a certain suppression of Aristotle because he's very eager to show the originality of his work and also the usefulness of the Greek tradition for the West. Anyway, I know nothing at all about Lemnides, so that was very interesting. I wanted to ask you a bit more about Lemnides, where he stands in this tradition. There are two things I never considered before in your talk about virtue of politics and its translation from one discourse to another. And one was the foundationalist. But I was expecting you to use the word coherentist, because in modern epistemology or theory of reason, theory of truth, you have two theories of truth. You have the foundationalist and you have the coherentist. And it sounds to me as though your Indian Buddhist philosophers are really coherentist. And as they pass through Taoism into China, they are coherentist thinkers because everything is interdependent. That's the definition of coherentism, right? The truth of a system is vouched for, is justified in terms of its fit. And when you construct a worldview, that worldview is the best worldview for you, but you don't make any absolute foundational claims like this is the only worldview. The foundation says this is the one correct truth, and the coherentists are trying to justify truth claims in a different way. So I guess the two questions I have for you. One is the coherentist versus foundationalist dichotomy that you introduced. And the second is where the Byzantines or Lemnides fit in. How do they pronounce that in Athens, by the way? I always said Lemnides, but you said Lemnides, I think. Maybe it must be Lemnides.
Oh, I have no idea. I never spoken about him to anyone.
Okay. Well, I asked you about those two things: the Byzantine tradition, where it stands in terms of Aristotelian prudential thinking, phronesis, and then the coherentist versus foundationalist.
Maybe I'll start with the Byzantine one.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not that good with the late Byzantine history, but I know. So I'm getting these quotes because they're doing this source book of Byzantine philosophy.
Yeah.
And so I basically just looked through all the stuff on political thought.
Mm-hmm.
And
This is a deeply unfair question, by the way.
oh, yeah.
But so it's a sign of my respect for your intelligence that I throw it at you.
I did it, so I'm sure that it's on me. Yeah. I think I do think he was a very important thinker, and because his student Dukas Lascaris is also an important political thinker in his own right, with the book by Angelov.
That's right. He's my colleague.
Yeah. Cool. So that because Lascaris, he theorizes, he's an Aristotelian, and he theorizes everything in terms of political friendship. So I do think my impression is that basically things are pretty silent until the Komnenans, until Anna Komnene, she commissions all this complete set of Aristotle commentaries. And from then on, that becomes more popular. And I think probably the sack of Constantinople really catalyzes people like Lemaides to look back in the tradition and find new answers. And then we have his student Lascaris. But the Lascaris dynasty does not succeed in taking back. It's the Palaiologos who take back Constantinople, which then they lose shortly after. So, but I think he is one of the big names in Byzantine philosophy, especially late Byzantine. Yeah. And then the second one.
Could I just mention,
yes.
Angelo's first book, you mentioned his monograph on Lascaris.
Yeah.
But his first book was about orations as a medium of political philosophy.
Oh.
And that's worth looking at because he also talks about Aristotle's rhetoric and so forth, and the way that I think it's actually a somewhat different approach to truth finding. It's much more practically oriented than the Lascaris is more theoretical. So
okay, I'll look at that. Okay. And then for the Buddhist case, I think it's even stranger than what you were suggesting because generally our standard of truth would be that our beliefs correspond to some state of affairs in the world. So this is the correspondence theory of truth.
yeah,
Whereas I think for the Buddhists, they are operating on a pragmatic standard of truth, where statements are assertable if they serve some good, and the good is defined in terms of reducing suffering. So, which is just to say, they're worthier than even that, the coherentists,
I think coherentist might be a useful category to understand, but it may not be, because as you say, the Buddhist approach is so different. It's about, we should bring my wife here, she's a Buddhist, actually a Buddhist, but it's about removing illusion. I mean, epistemologically speaking, you remove illusion, but what you get at the end is the pure love, right, of the other, selflessness, a true selflessness. So it's not really creating worldview. Coherentists are trying to create an alternative to defend worldviews without having foundational needs, right? So maybe it's a limited use, coherentist idea. Do anyone in the audience have a question or a comment they would like to make about this? I realize this is quite unusual. Maybe Patrick just, or you're just trying to go on.
I'm always trying to give attention to I did have a question. Seeing how did I understand you correctly, just to sum up very briefly, that Patrizi is thinking in Aristotelian terms or concepts, but he's using a lot of Ciceronian language. And so Ciceronian terms but thinking Aristotelian.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that's just a reflection of the way education worked in his lifetime, that when they were learning to write Latin, they're just writing like Cicero? So there's a cult of Cicero linguistically, and how much of that just bleeds into the way they write then when they're actually thinking later on? So Patrizi, specifically, but humanists in general.
Right. I think that's a really good point. I was recently thinking about how, I think if you zoom out enough, the history of thought basically tracks the history of education. And so, I guess, I don't know about what Patrizi thinks about Cicero, but at least for the jurist case, right, he was trying to fit the Latin jurist into this Greek Aristotelian mode. And I think yesterday you mentioned that their humanists would call virtue politics like Ciceronianism.
Yes. That was, I asked myself some years ago why if Patrizi is founding a new type of approach to political theory, which relies on it's applied history essentially, trying to build up prudence from a study of history, why this isn't identified as a particular method. And then I learned from Jan Watzig, who is the editor of Lipsius Politica, that in the Dutch context in the late 16th century, they referred to what I call historical prudential method. They call it the Ciceronian method. And the reason is the Cicero's De Officiis was used as a textbook for people who had this view that virtue, it was an anti-Machiavellian. The anti-Machiavellians, put it this way, there are two types of anti-Machiavellianism. There's the scholastic type, which the Catholic Church endorses, and just it's a reinvention of scholasticism. And then there's a humanist version of anti-Machiavellianism, which goes to Lipsius, Grotius, Pufendorf, Montesquieu, and the founding fathers of the United States. They're using this historical method to try to locate what the best, practical solution is to a problem. So it's interesting they call it Ciceronian in the 16th century. But anyways, we're going to have to go on to our next speaker, but I just want to commend you on this really incredibly wide-ranging, you're kind of laying out problematic for the study of virtue politics, and also I think Patrizi even, by having this very, very wide optic, which includes the Chinese tradition, Taoism, and Buddhism, and Byzantine. I think aside from, I think that you have the first toe in the water for Byzantine and for Buddhist Taoist tradition. Anyway, thank you, and let's pass on from the right brain to the left brain. Philology is immensely left brain according to. It's concerned with truth in a very practical way of getting the text correctly. So I want to introduce Caroline Engelmayer, who was an original member of the Patrizi project team. We have two left. There's Molly and Caroline. Molly's going to speak a little later. And she has been, she is conducting the career of a young professor while she's still a graduate student at Harvard I guess you're especially in English. Is that
English
right?
and classics.
English and classics, right. So, so she has been doing, I think, most of the most important Latin textual work of our team, having edited or given us the provisional edition of the Poema de Libri Quattuor, and then also the De Origine Orbis Sani. She's been working on that. Do you have any estimate for when that might? I don't want to pin you down.
No.
I want to pin you down.
To make more progress. I'm hoping to make more progress at least this summer. And here I should also give a big thank you to Stefano, who very kindly offered his advice and guidance about some of the textual issues. So I'm hoping that that'll also help us make progress, his input as well.
Yes, Stefano, among his many other talents as a fine philologist, has edited many texts of Bruni and especially Manetti. He's a very important Manetti scholar, never gets mentioned. But his main job is running ISI, so he luxuriates in his few opportunities to do real philology. He's been very, very generous with Caroline. So you're going to speak about the day Laudibus Sophia. Yes, today, and then we'll have our break, and then we'll go on. What are you doing in real life in the English department? You do. What's your thesis topic?
My thesis topic is about Renaissance receptions of Altus Herodes.
Okay.
A fictional collection of letters that claim to be from the abandoned women of classical mythology to real heroes.
Yes, that's very well situated for obtaining jobs.
So we hope.
Okay, well, please.
Thank you. And I should also mention I have a handout. I don't know what the best one
Oh,
is.
I can handle that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I can definitely.
Voglio ringraziare il professor Engels, il professor Baker e l'Accademia di Intronati per aver organizzato questo convegno su Francesco Patrizi da Siena e per avermi invitata a fare questa presentazione. Sono grata anche a tutti voi per la vostra presenza. Mi fa piacere avere l'occasione di parlare di Patrizi e di un progetto editoriale in cui sono coinvolta insieme al professor Hengens. In questo saggio cerco di presentarvi un testo di Patrizi che è ancora abbastanza sconosciuto, l'Oratio dell'Arum Philosophiae, di cui stiamo preparando un'edizione critica e una traduzione in inglese in vista alla pubblicazione nella rivista Rinascimento. Il mio intervento procederà in 4 parti. All'inizio descrivo il contesto dell'orazione, analizzando la rivalità intellettuale fra gli umanisti fiorentini e quelli senese nel 400. Poi offro un breve riassunto delle argomentazioni di Patrizi nell'orazione, spiegando le ragioni per cui, secondo lui, gli studiosi senesi devono imparare la filosofia. Nella terza sezione discuto della tradizione testuale, affermando che i 2 manoscritti superstiti discendono da un archetipo perso. Infine, spiego come Patrizi utilizza citazioni e materiali dalle sue fonti classiche principali, autori come Cicerone, Quintiliano e Plutarco. Nel 1426 Patrizi compose un discorso per celebrare l'inizio dell'anno scolastico all'Università di Siena. Il discorso, l'Oratio dell'Arum Philosophiae, è la prima nota orazione umanistica pronunciata presso l'Università di Siena. L'opera attesta la precocità di Patrizi. Pronunciata quando aveva appena 13 anni, cerca di introdurre nel curriculum universitario discipline umanistiche come la retorica, la poesia e la filosofia morale. Negli anni 20 del 400, queste materie stavano entrando nei programmi delle università di Bologna e di Firenze, rivale di Siena. Come spiega il professore Hengens nella sua monografia La meritocrazia politica nel Rinascimento italiano, ora disponibile in italiano grazie alla traduzione eccellente di Stefano Baldassari e Alessio Panicchi, gli studiosi che tentavano di introdurre gli studia humanitatis nei curricula italiani avevano riscontrato già un certo successo nel più prestigioso ateneo italiano, vale a dire Bologna. Anche la grande rivale di Siena, cioè Firenze, aveva iniziato a sondare il terreno tramite una serie di orazioni per vedere se fosse il caso di istituire formalmente cattedre di greco, poesia e filosofia morale. Come osserva il professore Hengens, il discorso tenuto da Patrizi può essere considerato, nel contesto senese, un primo passo in quella direzione. Il discorso di Patrizi, inoltre, ha consolidato il suo status di promettente giovane studioso dell'antichità classica. L'adolescente Patrizi probabilmente non ha scritto l'orazione completamente da solo. Il testo sembra riflettere l'influenza e forse persino l'intervento editoriale di Androcchio Petrucci, umanista e nobile, e del suo stretto alleato Giovanni di Franchino Patrizi, padre del nostro Patrizi. Entrambi appartenevano ai Nove, un'alleanza potente di famiglie aristocratiche senesi. Il fatto che Patrizi ha pronunciato questo discorso segnala l'importanza del giovane per le aspirazioni di queste famiglie nobili verso l'umanesimo. Infatti, il discorso anticipa alcune delle linee portanti della carriera successiva di Patrizi. Dopo averlo pronunciato, ha studiato retorica e filosofia latina e greca con Francesco Filelfo presso l'Università di Siena dal 1435 al 1438. Nella sua orazione, Patrizi difende il sistema di formazione umanistica di cui avrebbe poi beneficiato. Dopo è stato professore di retorica all'Università dal 1441 al 1446, contribuendo a plasmare l'insegnamento dei testi classici a Siena. Nel suo discorso, come vedremo, lui sostiene che l'atto di coltivare lo studio della filosofia non solo conferisce gloria terrena ai umanisti, ma rende l'anima stessa più virtuosa e, di conseguenza, promuove una città armoniosa e pacifica. Il suo interesse per le modalità e le ragioni della promozione della virtù civica a Siena prefigura il suo magnum opus De Institutione Republicae, un trattato di nuovi libri che esplora la struttura di governo e il sistema educativo della Repubblica ideale. Anche in quel testo lui include critiche non particolarmente velate alla Siena del Quattrocento. Esorta le famiglie dirigenti della città a ristabilire quella virtù civica che lui teme sia stata erosa dai violenti conflitti politici che hanno portato al suo esilio dal 1457 fino alla sua morte nel 1494. Anche a distanza di decenni, la visione dell'apprendimento umanistico che l'adolescente precoce ha ricevuto dai suoi mentori ha lasciato un'impressione profonda. Che cosa, dunque, argomenta Patrizi nell'oratio della Ludus Philosophiae? E inizia con una captatio benevolentiae. Dopo aver ascoltato il discorso del peripatetico Formione sulle virtù del servizio militare, racconta Patrizi, il generale Annibale l'ha considerato ridicolo, perché il filosofo greco non era mai stato soldato, non aveva alcuna esperienza diretta della materia di cui discuteva in modo astratto. Allo stesso modo, continua il giovane oratore, il suo pubblico potrebbe respingere la sua orazione sull'umanesimo a buon diritto, poiché non ha la profonda erudizione dei suoi ascoltatori illustri. Qui Patrizi utilizza la sua giovanezza come un vantaggio retorico. Osserva che, nonostante la sua mancanza di esperienza ed erudizione, sape parlare davanti a un gruppo di uomini estremamente culti. Tuttavia decide di proseguire perché confida nella benevolenza dei suoi ascoltatori. Solo la filosofia, Patrizi sostiene, ci permette di coltivare l'anima, evitare l'ignoranza, praticare la temperanza, sopportare fatiche dure, fuggire agli affari mondani, conseguire la giustizia e garantire che la nostra fama sopravviva dopo la morte. Poiché potrebbe essere impraticabile lodare la filosofia nella sua totalità, Patrizi promette invece di concentrarsi solo su alcuni aspetti dei studi umanistici. Inizia dalla teologia, che chiama la prima di tutte le scienze, omnium scientiarum princeps. Questo ramo della filosofia, spiega Patrizi, insegna ai mortali la divinità, la religione, la pietà, la santità, le cerimonie, la fede, i giuramenti, i tempi, i santuari e i sacrifici. La teologia guida l'umanità verso la verità cristiana e ci aiuta a scoprire i riti appropriati dell'osservanza religiosa. Di conseguenza, fornisce il fondamento di una società virtuosa. La pietà verso Dio ispira anche la responsabilità verso la famiglia e lo Stato. Poi passa al diritto civile, le cui origini colloca nell'Atene antica. L'eroe di Patrizi in questa parte del discorso è Solone. L'oratore spiega che le sue riforme politiche hanno trasformato la polis in uno stato completamente nuovo, ex integro novem pietate. Anche Licurgo ha migliorato la virtù spartana perché ha instillato nel popolo rispetto per i governanti e l'ha guidato verso un governo giusto, soprattutto promuovendo la frugalità e la modestia. I Romani hanno imitato i sistemi giuridici di queste città greche. A partire dalle 12 tavole, Patrizi offre una breve rassegna della giurisprudenza romana, ricordando i contributi di Publio Papiro, Appio Claudio Cecco, Publio Scipione Nasica, Bruto, Cornelio Antipatro e molti altri. Conclude, questa giurisprudenza protegge gli stati. Da questa le cose giuste vengono separate dalle cose ingiuste. I buoni mantengono il proprio diritto, ma i cattivi sono oppressi dal temore delle leggi. La medicina, la musica, la geometria e l'astronomia appartengono all'ampia definizione di filosofia proposta da Patrizi. Così come la filosofia cura la mente, la medicina cura il corpo. Per questo gli inventori della medicina, figure come Apollo, Esculapio e Ippocrate, sono stati giustamente onorati per i loro contributi. Anche la musica dimostra i benefici dello studio della filosofia. Molti studiosi, Patrizi osserva, concludono che dopo Mercurio, Pitagora era l'inventore umano di quest'arte, scoprendo come produrre l'armonia. La musica stimola gli animi languentes animi, e calma quelli che sono troppo appassionati. Alessandro Magno sviluppava spesso un fervore bellico, stimolato dal suo musicista Timoteo, e poi veniva calmato dallo stesso uomo dopo la guerra. Gli Spartani e i Romani usavano la musica per scopi simili. Socrate, in vecchiaia, si è dedicato alla lira per accrescere la propria erudizione. Poi Patrizi discute della geometria e dell'astronomia. Pitagora, Platone, Archimede e Sesto Pompeo eccellevano nella prima. Gli Assiri e poi gli Egizi erano pionieri della seconda. Grazie anche al lavoro di Archimede, Pericle è riuscito a rassicurare l'esercito ateniese che aveva interpretato un'eclisse come un presagio funesto, perché ha spiegato la causa naturale di questo fenomeno. Ma l'eloquenza, suggerisce Patrizi, è probabilmente il ramo più importante della filosofia. La dialettica rafforza la memoria e ci permette di accedere a ogni tipo di conoscenza. La retorica ci rende capaci di consolare gli afflitti, di liberarci dalla paura e l'ira e di insegnare agli ignoranti. Non sorprende quindi che costituisca il fondamento della società. Ripetendo un episodio che viene raccontato con Socrate e Cicerone, osserva che tutti sono d'accordo che quando una volta gli uomini vagavano dispersi nelle selve, sono stati riuniti dall'oratoria. Da qui le città sono state fondate con leggi. e sono state consolidate dalla società umana. Secondo Patrizi, l'oratoria era il mezzo attraverso cui sovrani come Pisistrato, Pericle, Filippo di Macedonia, Alessandro Magno e Giulio Cesare hanno stabilito il loro potere. Persino Annibale, più famoso per la sua forza nella guerra che per la sua erudizione, non ignorava le virtù dell'oratoria. Alla fine della sua vita ha studiato retorica con tale impegno che si è assicurato una fama che durerà per sempre. A causa delle molte virtù della filosofia, Patrizi esorta i suoi ascoltatori a coltivare gli studia humanitatis con il massimo zelo. L'oratio di Laudibus Philosophiae è conservata in 2 manoscritti. Uno, che indichiamo con la sigla T, si trova presso l'Archivio e Biblioteca Capitolare di Toledo. Questo manoscritto, creato nel Cinquecento, è una miscellanea. Contiene vari discorsi, lettere e poesie. L'altro manoscritto, che chiamiamo M, è conservato alla biblioteca John Rylands dell'Università di Manchester. Questo manoscritto, prodotto in Italia a metà del XV secolo, è una raccolta miscellanea di lettere e discorsi latini di autori come Poggio Bracciolini, Boccaccio e Filelfo. E include anche una lettera che Patrizi ha scritto al suo ex studente Achille Petrucci, che in seguito sarebbe diventato cancelliere della Repubblica Senese. Applicando la regola di Christeller, secondo cui la provenienza di un manoscritto miscellaneo coincide presumibilmente con quella del testo più raro contenuto nella raccolta, si concluderebbe che il manoscritto è di origine senese, mentre il manoscritto di Toledo, ampiamente studiato da Sesto Prete in un volume della serie Studi e Testi Vaticani, è probabilmente di origine ferrarese. Nel manoscritto di Manchester, il titolo del discorso è De Studiarum Artium Optimarum Laudibus, invece di De Laudibus Philosophiae, il titolo nel manoscritto Toledo. La differenza nel titolo è importante, poiché Optima Artis è uno dei sinonimi umanistici per Studia Humanitatis. La nostra analisi ha rivelato che M e T derivano indipendentemente da un archetipo scomparso. Qui presento solo alcuni esempi della nostra evidenza a sostegno di questa ricostruzione della tradizione testuale. E in questa parte dell'intervento vi consiglio di consultare l'handout dove sono stampate le citazioni a cui riferisco. Si consideri la seguente frase nell'orazione di Patrizi. Quando discute gli autori famosi di Roma antica, Patrizi si chiede, quid denique reliquos innumerabilis, qui eorum doctissimis scriptis, uis cuiles sapientiae fundamenta eccerunt. Perché infine dovrei menzionare gli innumerevoli altri che con i loro dottissimi scritti hanno stabilito i fondamenti di questa sapienza civile. In questa frase non vi sono problemi grammaticali, quindi non è necessario emendare, ma è una legge. Quid denique reliquos innumerabilis, qui eorum doctissimis scriptis, huius cuilis sapientiae fundamenta auxerunt. Hanno accresciuto i fondamenti, invece di hanno stabilito i fondamenti. Escludendo la possibilità di uno scriba insolitamente interventista, la presenza di questi 2 verbi costituisce un errore separativo che suggerisce che entrambi discendano da un archetipo perso. Altre prove indicano che non possa derivare da T, esortando il suo pubblico a coltivare gli studia humanitatis. Patrizi esclama in T, e questo è il numero 2 sull'handout, irritevolque Demosthenem clarissimum illum oratorem, qui iniquo animo se aiebat, siquando vificum ante lucana industria vinceretur. Manca un verbo nella proposizione relativa. Include il verbo necessario, fere, come ho indicato su handout. E la frase ha il significato: imitiamo quel celeberrimo oratore Demostene, che soleva dire che lo sopporterebbe con animo ostile se fosse superato dal lavoro mattutino degli artigiani. Allo stesso modo, T non può derivare da M. Patrizi paragona la mente incolta a un campo non lavorato. In M la frase è, questo è il numero 3 sull'handout, namque ut ager quamvis ferax ad fertilis sine cultu atque fossione fructus vel minimos affert, sic animus ipse sine doctrina ac studiis bonarum artium, quae quidem omnia hoc uno philosophiae nomine continenti. C'è un problema con l'espressione fructus vel minimos affert. L'idea che il campo incolto produca comunque dei frutti indebolisce il punto di Patrizi sull'importanza della coltivazione della mente. Ti evita questo problema. In quella versione del testo, Patrizi dice ut ager quamvis ferat ad fertilis sine cultu atque fossione nullos fructus vel minimos affert, che si traduce come, infatti, così come un campo, benché ricco e fertile, non produce alcun frutto, produce pochissimi frutti, senza la coltivazione e lo scavo, così l'anima senza istruzione e senza lo studio delle belle arti, che sono tutte contenute in questo unico nome di filosofia. Il fatto che ti includa una parola necessaria o messa in M prova che M non deriva da quel manoscritto. Che fonti classiche cita Patrizi in questo discorso e come le utilizza? Forse non sorprende che Patrizi, che esorta i suoi ascoltatori a partecipare alla tradizione dell'indagine filosofica, le cui origini risalgono fino a Platone e Aristotele, metta in mostra la propria conoscenza di testi greci. Quando Patrizi costituisce un profilo biografico di Pitagora, ad esempio, utilizza materiali che ha trovato in Diogene Laertio. L'osservazione secondo cui Pitagora definiva il filosofo come una persona che cerca la verità, sapientia studiosus, desiderioso della sapienza in italiano, viene proprio dalla descrizione di Pitagora che Diogene ha composto. Patrizi deriva dall'autore greco anche la sua conoscenza dei viaggi di Pitagora a Creta, in Egitto e in Italia alla ricerca del sapere filosofico. Il viaggio di Democrito in Egitto, Persia, nel Mar Rosso, in India ed Etiopia e il soggiorno di Platone in Sicilia. In tutti questi casi ha consultato i resoconti biografici di questi pensatori. Per Patrizi, Plutarco occupa una posizione della massima importanza nel cannone delle autorità greche. Nel lodare la capacità della filosofia di garantire la tranquillità dell'animo ai studiosi, lui racconta al suo pubblico che quando Dionisio di Siracusa, studente di Platone, è stato esiliato dal governo tirannico, qualcuno gli ha chiesto che cosa gli servivano la filosofia e l'insegnamento del suo docente. Lui ha risposto che posso sopportare con un animo sereno e con facilità una tempesta così grande di sfortuna. Ut aequo animo facile quae perferam cuius adversae fortunae tam ingentem tempestatum. Questo aneddoto proviene dalla vita di Timoleonte di Plutarco e il riferimento dimostra la profonda conoscenza di Patrizi delle vite. Il racconto di come Pericle ha liberato ateniesi dalla paura, utilizzando calcoli astronomici per dimostrare che l'eclisse del Sole rifletteva il corso normale della natura e non un presagio funesto, è tratto dalla vita di Pericle di Plutarco. Altrove, però, le apparenti citazioni di testi greci da parte di Patrizi riflettono l'influenza mediatrice di autori latini. Ad esempio, la sua descrizione di Pitagora come protos euretes dell'armonia è tratto quasi alla lettera da Quintiliano. In particolare, Quintiliano ha offerto a Patrizi una fonte preziosa di informazioni su Platone. Nel suo discorso, ad esempio, Patrizi osserva che nella Repubblica Platone ha argomentato che la musica fosse necessaria per sostenere la vita dei cittadini. Quel passo dell'Audius Philosophiae ricrea, quasi alla lettera, il sommario delle idee del filosofo greco contenuto nell'Institutio Oratoria. Quando Patrizi riferisce a materiali greci, a volte adatta invece testi di Cicerone. Patrizi osserva che ha scoperto che i più antichi scrittori di retorica erano i siciliani Empedocle, Corace e Tisia. Antifonte è stato il primo a comporre un'orazione. Sebbene non lo riconosca esplicitamente, lui deriva questo resoconto dal Brutus di Cicerone. Allo stesso modo, Patrizi afferma che Pisostrato, Pericle, Filippo di Macedonia e Alessandro Magno hanno ottenuto più potere grazie alla loro eloquenza che alla loro forza militare e politica. Questa storia della retorica greca si basa strettamente sul de oratore dello scrittore romano. Che cosa possiamo dedurre dalla tendenza di Patrizi a raccogliere dati sulla storia greca attraverso fonti latine, senza riconoscere tali mediazioni? Si può suggerire che il giovane umanista cerchi di creare l'impressione di aver frequentato profondamente le opere del cannone greco. Con questa strategia tenta di rafforzare la propria autorevolezza intellettuale in un'epoca del Rinascimento italiano in cui la conoscenza del greco era ancora meno diffuso rispetto a quella del latino. Patrizi costruisce dunque la persona di un umanista sapiente oltre la sua età. Tale immagine è coerente con il suo approccio ai Studia Humanitatis in questa orazione. Adottando una definizione ampia di filosofia, lui si presenta come un'autorità in campi che vanno dalla musica alla medicina, dalla teologia alla retorica e oltre. Di conseguenza propone implicitamente Siena, accanto a Firenze, come luogo in cui coltivare queste attività umanistiche. Dobbiamo quindi evitare di interpretare questo discorso solo come un esercizio marginale di un giovane inesperto. Piuttosto, dell'Audius Philosophiae è una dichiarazione di orgoglio civico senese. È un annuncio delle ambizioni intellettuali di Patrizi, sia per la sua città, sia per la propria carriera. Grazie.
I accused Caroline of being left-brain philologist, but she just disproved me that she's a historian as well. So this is, I think you're correct, this is a rather important text. It was supposedly written by Patrizi at the age of 13 in 1426, that's the usual dating. I think we're coming to the conclusion that it must have been edited at a later period, and it's part of his, as we were saying yesterday, Patrizi's corpus is a corpus, and it does try to, it references itself at various points. One interesting thing in the second book of Patrizi's De Repubblica is that he doesn't talk about law. And if you know anything about the history of the University of Siena, it's dominated by the law faculty. So to not mention law is rather strange. I'm not sure that Patrizi's mature idea was that law even needed to be studied other than in context of discipleship or mentorship, like Cicero. But here he talks about law in this oration, and it gives you a much better idea of what he thinks the law should be. But as you rightly point out, this is an important document in the Sienese intellectual history, because if you go back to Paul Grenler's magisterial work on the history of universities in Italy, he places the entrance of the humanities into the universities roughly begins in the 1420s. All right. So humanism as a movement founded by Petrarch is founded outside the universities and in some way in opposition to the universities. Since in Italy, university study is legal study, dominant legal study. Theology is mostly done in religious orders. And medicine is of course, the second study of Italian universities. So usually the humanists bring themselves into university via the arts and medicine track. So there's been a lot of study more recently about the entrance of humanities into the university. My first PhD student, David Lyons, a comprehensive study. It's a fantastic study of the history of the University of Bologna. And he discusses the issue of how the humanities enter the universities, but more importantly, what happens to the humanities when they enter the university and how they become, in a certain sense, dehumanized. Or maybe I shouldn't put it that way, that's too hostile, but they become routinized in a way that they had not been when they were outside the university. So this is an important text, and it is also, as you say, a kind of manifesto of the classicizing element within Sienese society. Fioravanti has written a good deal about this, of course. He's, I think, the premier expert on Sienese learned life. But there was a very broad movement to return Siena to its classical roots, which ends in Patrizi's case with the De Origine Urbacinae. But you see already in the 1420s this kind of classicizing effort. In the fountain, in the center of the Campo, you see this beautiful fountain, which I believe is 1420s also, and it's a classicizing fountain. Where in the poems of Orazio Siccolo, who had his he's a great Latin poet wrote the Angelinatum here in Siena. He describes standing in front of the fountain. Someone remind me of the name of the fountain. Non posso ricordare il nome della fontana. Cosa? La fontana è nel centro di Cappelli, sì.
Fonte Gaia.
Gaia, Fontana Gaia. So Orazio talks about the poets of, including Patrizi, the poets of the classicizing movement, reciting their poetry in front of the fountain. And the ladies since it's quasi-romantic poetry, the ladies, the decent ladies, are on the second floor of the palace behind that, standing at the windows, listening to the classical poetry. Anyway, so I was very struck by this sense in which the De Latin Filosofia does fit into the Francesco of the 1420s, but as you say, it's later manipulated to be part of the purpose. Yeah. Are there questions from the audience about the? Yes, Paola.
Ringrazio figura sentito per intero prima di Cappelli. E ci sono tante cose interessanti che sono emerse e volevo dirti che per esempio nella sezione della musica, quando lui fa gli esempi di Socrate eccetera, quelli sono nelle istituzioni religiosi. Devi leggere attentamente quel capitolo che ho citato anch'io, il secondo del secondo libro, perché secondo me è tutto materiale che lui mette da parte, che conosce bene, poi lo arricchisce eccetera. Poi volevo dirti che forse andrebbe fatta una ricerca nell'archivio di Stato qua a Siena per capire se si può datare con sicurezza questa produzione. Io non so che tipo, questa ricerca forse l'ho fatta ma appunto tanto tempo fa, quindi non ricordo, però l'archivio è pieno di documenti, può essere che per l'università abbiano qualcosa che diciamo ti dia qualche elemento più preciso. Poi un'altra cosa, se lui l'ha scritta che era così giovane, tu ipotizzi l'intervento del padre, che sicuramente insomma era un uomo di cultura anche lui. Forse bisognerebbe dirlo meglio che un'ipotesi, perché non ha gli elementi. Sì. Poi volevo dirti un'altra cosa invece a proposito della ricostruzione, un po' della trasmissione. Allora, un archetipo, si stabilisce l'esistenza di un archetipo sulla base di errori comuni, ma qua errori comuni non ce ne sono, questi che ci hai fatto vedere. Cioè, secondo la tua ipotesi, almeno uno dei due riporta la lezione corretta, quindi non, diciamo, l'archetipo è dato dall'esistenza di almeno un errore comune e questi non sono errori comuni. L'altra cosa è che gli ecerunt auxerunt sono varianti, non è un errore, neppure nessuno dei due è un errore, sono varianti e tra l'altro queste sono espressioni locuzioni abbastanza comuni nel latino, quindi bisognerebbe vedere nel latino classico se c'è una fonte e se la fonte va in direzione di diecerunt o di auxerunt. E anche l'abitudine del copista, cioè vedere se, dico per dire, il manoscritto T è un manoscritto nel quale il copista tende, non lo so, potrebbe anche essere, insomma in fondo è un cambiamento, questo auxerunt sicuramente è accrescitivo, quindi insomma avere un'idea più precisa dell'usus, diciamo anche del copista, un quadro generale. Un'altra cosa ancora è che questo nullos fructus, ma fructus ver minimos va comunque secondo me, cioè è un po' duro, però io penso che in un latino umanistico, forse chi frequenta il latino umanistico, quindi anche questo, sì, anche questo io non direi che il senso non torna. Quel ferre, insomma, mi sembra invece più necessario, sì. Quindi questa era qualche osservazione.
Grazie mille per le osservazioni, sono come sempre molto utili. devo riconsiderare elementi dello stemma, della tradizione testuale grazie alle osservazioni. Quindi questo è un lavoro in corso, sto ancora pensando e ovviamente, naturalmente, devo riconsiderare come ho ricostruito lo stemma, il rapporto tra i manoscritti secondo questi suggerimenti. Quindi grazie mille. Per quanto riguarda l'idea anche di leggere il corpo di Patrizi come un corpo, come una raccolta con connessioni, con legami fra i testi, questa parte dei suggerimenti, delle osservazioni mi ha fatto pensare anche al suo intervento di ieri, perché c'era anche un riferimento all'episodio di Alessandro Magno, no? Di stimolare le passioni prima della guerra a causa della musica. Quindi questo è anche un elemento comune che indica che Patrizio, oppure un editore, una persona del suo contesto intellettuale, stava tentando di costruire il senso di un umanista che è esperto in poesia e anche in scrittura storica, in oratoria, e ci sono delle connessioni che dobbiamo considerare molto attentamente per avere un senso di Patrizi come un autore nella sua totalità. Quindi sono assolutamente d'accordo che questo approccio ha senso, che dobbiamo considerare come sono connessi questi testi. Grazie mille anche per questa parte delle osservazioni.
Ok. Dobbiamo continuare la discussione informalmente perché è pausa di caffè e dobbiamo mezz'ora per caffè. But yes, so let's come back, try to come back at 11:15 for the last two papers. And everyone was invited, obviously, to the cafe. Thank you for excellent morning, very varied morning, I have to say, from the variance of M to the variance of Buddhist epistemology. Let's get started. We have a small group, but there's an additional person online who will speak later. I guess this is what they call in American conferences the hardcore meeting. But all right, let's get started. And so our third speaker today, is the first of this half session, is Molly Goldberg. So Molly is another of the original members of the Patrizi Project. And I have to say that I didn't realize her skill, her great skill for a long time. We were doing various projects with collecting manuscripts and so on. But at a certain point I figured out that she's a stupendous translator. She's a wonderful translator, but very literary and very accurate at the same time, which is hard. Actually, the most important task of the Patrizi Project, as far as spreading knowledge of his works goes, is the English translation. This is obviously the condemnation of our lack of linguistic skill, but we have to mediate that lack of linguistic skill by presenting Patrizi in English. So Molly has been doing this very important work. Do we have an estimate on possible date of completion?
Well, I mean, I think I said I was going to do end of July.
Yeah.
I'm on book 7 right now out of 9.
Okay.
But I sort of haven't worked on it since I was sort of right before this. So I have the summer to kind of is my plan. But I think it'll be okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
We're hoping to post the complete translation into English of the day we publica by the end of July. 7 and 8 are shorter books, so it should go faster. And then 9 is the book on war. So we hope. So she's made this major contribution to the project, Molly's a graduate of Harvard College. She did classics in government, perfect preparation to be a Patrizi scholar. And then she spent a year at the Warburg Institute in London, where she did a thesis on Patrizi. And now she's going to go to Berkeley, in graduate school in Berkeley. I just talked with her future advisor a few weeks ago and told me how eager they are to have you in Berkeley. So she'll be studying the history of political thought in Berkeley. And as it happens, our other speaker this morning is also a graduate student at Berkeley. His name is Eero Arum. He will be joining us by Zoom quite soon. He Zoom quite soon. He's it's 5 a.m. So right now, so we hope he'll wake up in time. I'm sure he'll wake up in time to give us his talk. And I will introduce him when the time comes. But so I'll turn over the parola to you, Molly. So please, avanti.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just first, thank you. So just first to start off, I'd just like to thank James Hankins for everything he's taught me over the last 6 years since the inception of the Patrizi Project, and also for inviting me to speak here at my first conference. The focus of my talk is Patrizi's thought about wealth inequality in De Institutione Republicae, which I'll call DIR, his extensive work on republics. To start, I think it's necessary to provide a brief overview of some core points about Patrizi's thought on the subject. I'll first give a brief overview of the role equality and virtue play in the Republic for Patrizi. Next, I'll discuss Patrizi's idea that the rich tend to crowd out the poor, followed by an overview of Patrizi's solutions to inequality, as well as the extent to which he seems to call these solutions into question. Finally, I'll consider an apparent tension between the interests of the community and the individual in Patrizi's thought about property that seems to stem from the fact that Patrizi draws on both Greek and Roman thought for his work. I'll then outline what I think Patrizi's thought about wealth inequality might teach us about how virtue functions in his republic. Essentially, what I'd like to suggest is that because, in Patrizi's view, individuals' vice in the form of greed has the potential to greatly harm the republic, if not destroy it, by upsetting the balance of equality among the citizens, and because the laws and the institutions of the state have only limited power to guard against this harm, we should understand the cultivation of virtue among the entire populace collectively, and not just among individual magistrates or individual citizens generally, as essential for the republic's success. In other words, in his treatment of wealth inequality and its resulting problems, Patrizi cast doubt on the extent to which magistrates, laws, or institutions can control vice once it becomes a problem, once it gets out of control. And so essentially vice can't be allowed to develop. Hence, everyone has to be virtuous, to some extent at least. Just as equality, including a proportionally equal distribution of resources, is central to Patrizi's republic, so is a relatively equal distribution of virtue. I'll support this idea by bringing in two texts. First, from DIR, Patrizi's discussion of agrarian reforms in Rome, and second, from De Regno, Patrizi's discussion of the relationship between virtue and wealth.
We should call David that. DIR is our term of art in the Patrizi project for the De Institutione Republicae, so maybe
you prefer De Republica?
Well, yes, I just so explaining to the listeners.
Okay.
It's
Sure.
we can't use our own jargon.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all fine. So, wealth inequality is an important problem for Patrizi because he believes that republics rest on equality. Equality makes the state more stable and preserves citizens' liberty. Thus, in order to lay the foundations for his discussion of equality, Patrizi simply asserts, all agree that there is nothing that preserves a republic better than equality among the citizens. As Hankins puts it in his recent book, and I'll be referencing your work a lot in this because it's really the only person who's done this. As Hankins puts it in his recent book, Patrizi conceives of virtue as, quote, both the principal end of good government and the principal means for securing it. Put a bit differently, Patrizi believes the laws and institutions of the Republic are dependent upon virtue for their continued existence. As a result, a central aim of De Republica is creating a meritocracy of virtue, that is, a political system that gives the greatest power to the most virtuous. Hankins continues, only virtuous magistrates can create the conditions for a virtuous citizenry. A virtuous citizenry, in turn, can make its rulers better. The ideal state, then, is a virtuous cycle of virtue begetting virtue. But, as we all know, wealth also tends to beget power, and the wealthy are not necessarily virtuous. Patrizi, like many of his contemporaries, viewed excessive wealth as both a sign of vice, that is, of avarice, and a wellspring of further vices, including an obsession with luxuries, a dislike of honest work, and a general degradation of morals. Consequently, the excessively wealthy are a threat to the meritocracy of virtue because they have more power than others but less virtue. A virtuous economic position for Patrizi, following Aristotle, is a moderate amount of wealth that has been produced by honest hard work. And also, just to round things out, poverty, conversely, is a sign of vice, of laziness for Patrizi. To be clear, the impact of the excessively rich on the virtue meritocracy is not Patrizi's main stated concern. Instead, Patrizi is extremely concerned that the rich and their greed will come to take over more and more of the Republic's finite resources, making it impossible for the poor to possess anything. I put two quotations from De Republica to this effect on the slide. The first one comes from 3.6, a chapter focused on the ideal legal system, while the second comes from 6.3, the main chapter about private property. In addition to the problem overreach by the rich causes for the poor, it is also very bad for the state. The poor, Patrizi argues, will riot or otherwise cause unrest, or else become enamored with the populist leader seeking to capitalize on their support as a means to gain power. Put differently, the poor will be denied the opportunity to cultivate virtue by supporting themselves and a family through gainful employment, and as a result, will be denied participation in politics. Excluded from their own republic, they will strive, intentionally or not, to destabilize it. Patrizi seems to have had an easier time diagnosing the problem of wealth inequality than coming up with a solution for it. The most substantial discussion of potential solutions appears in the third chapter of Book 6, entitled On Private Estates. I've put some key selections from this discussion on the slide, and I'll go through them now. Patrizi initially considers equalizing property among the citizens. And also, just to clarify, Hankins sort of talked about this a bit earlier, but I just sort of want to go and cover it. Patrizi initially considers equalizing property among the citizens, writing, quote, as Aristotle attests, it would certainly not be difficult to equalize estates from the initial founding of a city, and it would offer no small benefit, since such an allotment would tend toward equality, and people's extravagance and laziness could easily be restrained by the laws. However, he concludes that doing so would only be possible in new states, since it would be unjust to take people's property away from them for redistribution to the poor. Quote, who could bear, he asks, without discord or carnage, for the richer or more prosperous to have their possessions taken away and distributed among the poorer citizens? As a compromise between equalizing property, which would privilege the interests of the community at the expense of the individual, and allowing individuals to keep their property, which, in cases of great wealth, would privilege the interests of the individual over that of the community, Patrizi suggests placing a limit on the amount of property people can possess, writing, quote, those who are in charge of creating laws ought to set a limit on landholding, so that the few do not seize the property of the many. However, as Patrizi immediately points out, agrarian laws have historically been unsuccessful, especially in Rome, which will go on to be his focus. He explains, quote, it is very difficult to maintain an agrarian law because the wealthy push out those who are poorer than them, and the more they possess, the more they strive to seize, end quote. And then also after, opposite. Thus, placing a limit on property potentially does not seem like a particularly promising solution to the problem either. why Patrizi proposes an agrarian law as part of his main solution to inequality, and then immediately recalls perhaps the most famous instance in history of an agrarian law failure, without, I should stress, giving any explicit explanation as to why the policy failed, is one of the motivating questions behind my talk today. I think it's helpful at this point to bring in Eric Nelson's book, The Greek Tradition and Republican Thought. And I think this also speaks to the discussion that we were just having earlier, in which he distinguishes between opposing traditions of Greek and Roman Republican thought. I don't have time to do his work justice, but I'll just say that concerning private property, the quote-unquote Greek tradition privileges the interests of the community and is concerned about the balance of wealth within the state, while the Roman tradition privileges the individual's quote-unquote right to possess their own property. The Roman law definition of justice in Justinian's Digest is, quote, the persistent and eternal will granted to each person what is theirs by right. Wealth inequality is only a problem if you ascribe to the values of this Greek tradition. If you ascribe to the Roman tradition, equality is almost expected. In line with the Greek tradition, Patrizi believes that inequality is a problem, but giving primacy to the Roman tradition's concern for individual property rights, he is only willing to advocate for equalizing measures at the beginning of a republic's life before people have the chance to obtain property. This distinction about Greek and Roman thought, to be clear, is not just about alliance with a tradition for Patrizi, but with the actual sources Patrizi uses to make his arguments. I don't have time to get into every example, which is kind of unfortunate given the talk that we just had. It seems like it would have been relevant, but as a preview for what I'll say in a few minutes, Patrizi's discussion of Roman agrarian laws is based not on any Roman source, but on Plutarch's account, one of the two Greek authored accounts. And I think that speaking to the conversation you're just having, I think, the influence of Plutarch in Patrizi's view is, I think, something like really important that we need to, in addition to Aristotle. Also, Patrizi's privileging of individual property rights goes beyond his specific concerns about wealth inequality. When Patrizi defines justice in 5.2, a chapter about his ideal citizen and the virtues of this citizen, he writes that justice, quote, grants each person what is theirs. In Latin, this is tribuit cuique quod suum est, practically the same language as in the digest, which is ius suum cuique tribuendi. Similarly, his explanation in Patrizi's explanation in 3.6 as to why the Republic requires a legal system is that, quote, in our society, we think it is better for everyone to possess what is theirs. Again, he writes quod suum sit. Admittedly, the word ius is absent from Patrizi's statements, but especially given that Patrizi assigns such weight to what is, quote, one's own as a matter of right or something quasi-right, as to give it preference over what would be in the Republic's best interest, I'm not sure that the absence is particularly meaningful. Okay. In what follows, I want to suggest that Patrizi's view is that avarice caused the failure of the Roman agrarian laws, and that he brings them up precisely in order to make this point. In a republic in which all are virtuous, greed won't drive people to try to surpass the property limit, and so the limit will hold. As I'll strive to show in Patrizi's discussion of Roman history, the Romans' great laws and great rulers, so great, I might add, that Patrizi holds them as exemplars throughout De Republica, completely failed to prevent greedy people from breaking the laws. Indeed, in Patrizi's version, the rich were able to seize control over the Republic and its institutions so wholly that they had Tiberius Gracchus, a reformer who, as he represents him, tried mainly to enforce the Republic's already existing agrarian law in a very reasonable way, killed as if he were an enemy of the state. Thus, my aim today is to suggest that, at least within the Republican context, virtue is not just important for the citizens taken as individuals, as in individual magistrates that wield power, or as individual citizens generally, but is also necessarily a project for the citizens of the Republic as a collective. What Patrizi's account of the Roman agrarian laws shows is that virtue does not just help maintain the laws, it is maybe the only thing keeping the laws going. Accordingly, in order to secure its continued existence, the Patrizian Republic must be a community that is virtuous. Further, it is through this communal approach to virtue that Patrizi attempts to compromise between privileging the property interests of the community and the individual. It is only when everyone in the Republic is virtuous in their approach to acquisition that there can be an equitable distribution of private property. Otherwise, there isn't really a good solution. In one scenario, people's acquisitive impulses spiral out of control with calamitous effect. In the other, property is unjustly equalized. In order to support these ideas, I'd like to turn now to Patrizi's account of the Roman agrarian laws. Patrizi's account of the history of Roman agrarian laws is mostly a much condensed version of Plutarch's account in his Life of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. That Patrizi follows Plutarch's account so closely is further evidence of his alignment with the Greek tradition, since the difference between Greek and Roman accounts of the Gracchus brothers' reforms is a main case study in Nelson's book. I've included a portion of Nelson's study of his argument on the slide, but his point here is that Roman writers like Livy and Cicero, but not Sallust, the exception that proves the rule, are almost uniformly critical of the Gracchi for trying to take away people's property, while the Greek writers Plutarch and Appian hold a much more positive view, understanding the Gracchi as laudably trying to improve the balance of wealth within the state. Henkin's noting this, and again, I'm sorry for referencing your work, but Henkin's noting this writes, and this is also on the slide, that Patrizi generally considers private property a, quote, question of civil prudence, not right, that should be made subject to the ends of the whole political community. I think this is true insofar as Patrizi's concern about wealth inequality stems from his desire to distribute property in a way that benefits the state's interest, and insofar as he discusses property, quote-unquote, rights, without actually using the word jus. But I think, as I just argued, that Patrizi privileges private property to such an extent that it seems maybe like a quasi-right, even if he doesn't use the word jus. Rather, Patrizi seems maybe conflicted over whether to treat private property as a question of civil prudence or of right, which is possibly why he has difficulty proposing solutions to wealth inequality. Following Henkin's understanding of Patrizi's use of historical sources as, quote, historico-prudential, I think we should read Patrizi's discussion of agrarian laws in Rome as a story about what happens when vice gets out of hand, and not just, but also, of the folly of redistribution that is Henkin's reading, which I might add certainly seems to be something else that he's trying to say. The vice of the rich is at the center of Patrizi's version of events, even a bit more than it is in Plutarch's account, which, as I just mentioned, is quite critical of the rich. Following Plutarch, Patrizi begins by describing the Romans' passage of the land limit law. Unlike Plutarch, who writes that the laws initially worked to curb the rapacity of the rich, Patrizi describes the rich as immediately acting badly. But at first, the wealthy worked to cheat the law by using substitutes who would either lease the land or buy it under a false name. Then they began to openly take possession of the land while driving out all the destitute. In Patrizi's account, as in Plutarch's, the rich are described as greedy for opposing Tiberius's, quote, very lenient agrarian law, which he stresses did not even punish the crimes of the rich and actually would have compensated them for their unjustly gained property. In other words, the institutions of the Republic have become so overpowered by the rich that not only have the laws ceased to exercise any power over them, the rich have even come to view following the law as an injustice. The rich fight not to be punished for having broken the laws, quote, as if they were fighting to defend their city's walls or their country's freedom. Patrizi does not just blame the rich for the deaths of both Tiberius and Gracchus, he also highlights how the rich have come to hold a perverse degree of sway over the public honors, noting that, quote, Tiberius's killer was even praised and recognized with almost divine honors. Notably absent from Patrizi's greatly condensed version of Plutarch's account is any nuance in Tiberius's behavior. In Plutarch's long account of Tiberius's attempts to pass his reforms, Tiberius is not entirely blameless. For example, Plutarch describes a lengthy conflict between Tiberius and another tribune, Octavius, culminating in Tiberius's, quote, illegal and unseemly removal of Octavius from office. Thus, as much as the story is a warning to would-be reformers, it is also a warning about the danger of greed. Greed on the part of the rich doesn't just harm the poor, once the rich become rich and greedy enough, they take over the state itself. It isn't just that in the face of great wealth, the institutions of the state become powerless to limit illegal behavior by the rich take control of the republic and its institutions. As we've just seen in the conflict between the wealthy Romans and the Gracchi, or as we might alternatively understand it, between the wealthy Romans and the Roman state, limiting inequalities of resources is not just about the relationship between individuals within the state, but about sustaining the state itself. Thus, just as an individual's excessive wealth is both born of their vice and fosters more vice, wealth inequality both comes about because of vice at a societal scale and creates a vicious cycle that threatens the state itself. In order for the republic not to be destroyed by avarice and the wealth inequality that results from avarice, all of the citizens need to be virtuous. It isn't enough to simply have virtuous magistrates or to encourage citizens to be virtuous. In fact, the most dangerous citizens are perhaps those who are not interested in pursuing virtue in the first place. The survival of the republic, then, depends on making sure the entire citizenry is virtuous. To help illustrate this idea, and by way of conclusion, I'd like to briefly turn to Patrizi's work on kingships, De Regno, where Patrizi again takes up the issue of wealth inequality with a completely different conclusion. In De Republica, equality is laudable, even necessary for a free republic. In the context of a kingship, it is, quote, great difficulty. Inequality, rather than being the source of political and social problems, as well as a sign of vice in the community at large, is the appropriate and natural state of affairs. Wealth is not just a sign of vice, but the appropriate reward for virtue. The obvious explanation for this change is that wealth inequality is part and parcel of a kingship. We would expect a monarch to be the main holder of wealth in the state. And since for Patrizi, it is the monarch's preeminent virtue that makes him alone suited to hold supreme power, Patrizi can no longer argue that the extremely wealthy are unvirtuous. Instead, the monarch can be both supremely rich and supremely virtuous. Hankins discusses this complete reversal of opinion in his recent book, attributing it to the fact that, quote, in the De Regno, Patrizi holds that a just monarch will be able to prevent factionalism and oppression through his unique, overwhelming power. The causes of inequality among households can be traced to the injustices of powerful persons, and a good principle prevents such injustices from occurring in the first place. An individual's unvirtuous behavior is then no longer a problem for the community, unless, of course, that individual is the monarch himself. In this sense, the distribution of virtue is a key difference between republics and kingships for Patrizi. In a republic, the responsibility of promoting virtue and virtuous behavior among all the citizens is a burden shared jointly by the entire community, and so great inequities of wealth pose a problem for the state. In a kingship, it is really only the monarch's virtue that matters, and so wealth inequality is a non-issue. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Molly. This is a very stimulating talk, and it makes me rethink a lot of things that I'm saying in the book, even though you're citing my books so often, you're making me rethink my own book, so that's a good thing. I just wanted to point out a few connections with the other humanists. As we had Silvia here, she could tell us more about this, but one of Filelfo's great themes in his De Exilio, his most important work of political theory on exile, is the perversions created in the state by wealthy people. And he's thinking, in fact, quite literally, and mentions quite literally, Cosimo de' Medici, because he has been kicked out of Florence by Cosimo de' Medici, and he's aligned himself with the anti-Medicians, who have a major problem with the Medici, powerful people, powerful wealthy people controlling the state. As you will all know, the Romans had a theory as well. Senators were not, in theory, not allowed to make money, or they were not allowed to make too much money. There was a law in Rome against senators engaging in more, they could not engage in more commerce than would be necessary to fill a single ship. In other words, they could sell off their agricultural produce, but only enough to fill a ship. If they had 2 ships, then they were merchants, and that was bad, because the Romans really thought merchants as terrible people, or morally suspect people, not terrible. And Patrizi has some of that. But one of the things that really strikes me about this discussion of wealth, and we haven't commented on this yet, but it's quite important. Patrizi thinks it's possible to have a permanent republic. In other words, the ancients mostly believe in cyclical. In fact, I think they universally believe in cyclical cycles of constitutions. There's a degenerated cycle of constitutions in Aristotle's Politics. There's the, and also, of course, in the Republic, Book 8 and 9, Plato talks about the decline of constitutions. And then Polybius, who I think Patrizi might have known a little bit about, Book 6, talks about a cycle of constitutions. But the idea of the Romans and the Greeks, or the Greeks really, is that cycles are inevitable. And one of the remarkable and kind of modern things about Patrizi is he thinks you can stop the cycle of degeneration in republics through virtue. But it depends on virtue. He's putting the burden of saving the republic on the virtuous themselves, right? And he's basically saying to them, you, the virtuous, have to make sure the republic stays virtuous and that the vicious are not allowed to take over. And we're going to do this through education, but also through the example of the virtuous, who Patrizi thinks many of them are going to be nobles. Not necessarily nobles, but people who are of long residence in the state, very committed to the state, who are public-minded. Those sort of people can actually keep the state from changing. And it's a remarkable thing. Most people would be very skeptical. Obviously, Machiavelli is extremely skeptical of this. But he thinks there's no such thing as a perfect constitution. But human beings, if they take responsibility for their moral lives and prevent the vicious, can actually stop the cycle of constitution. So it's a kind of utopia, you might even say. Okay, so I think that's very important. And the other thing that's quite interesting in this is Patrizi's insistence on work. Right? That everyone in the Republic should have some métier, some way of work. No one should be living off rents, in other words. No one should be idle. And the idle people, we talked about this yesterday, people who are idle are the ones who cause the Republic to have trouble. If everyone has a piece of work that they should do, they will not get into trouble. Idle hands are the devil's playground. But also and he considers, by the way, education and teaching and running the state as work. All of these should be considered as work. And the people who don't work should be kept from power, but ideally the state should not allow people, or should, through kind of moral suasion, make it a matter of contempt to live on your rents. So that's a rather interesting thing. It almost sounds kind of Marxist in a way, but of course non-Marxist. Okay, I'm just trying to think of other things that popped up in my mind while you were talking. Who's the author of Anarchy, State, and Republic in Total? I'm forgetting. This famous libertarian thinker at Harvard. Anyway, so there's a famous libertarian thinker at Harvard whose name is going to come back to me, with something called the Wilt-Chamberlain argument. So this is an argument why you should not redistribute property. This is Patrizi's argument. It's in the De Regno against redistribution. And it was reinvented in the 1990s. Robert Nozick, by Nozick, who is a famous libertarian thinker. So Nozick says, well, Patrizi says this: if you redistribute property, and everyone's equal, and then someone starts becoming unequal again in the course of time. And Nozick used the example of Wilt-Chamberlain as a man who was self-made. it would be deeply unjust to take away from a man who had earned his own wealth, and then take that wealth again, maybe 10 years later, and then give it to somebody who hasn't worked. So that he uses that argument in the De Regu. It's really quite remarkable that he anticipates Robert Nozick by 500 years or so. So that's one of the arguments against redistribution. I think it's a very sound argument against redistribution. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, you think he doesn't really trust the idea of limiting wealth through restraining usury and restraining profits by, you don't think that that's...
I mean, I think that is the policy that he wants, like, to implement.
Yes.
But I guess the thing that sort of was motivating when I was trying to think about what I wanted to say, was why. Because it's really quite striking in 6.3, like the way he arranges the argument, where he gives he starts with like Plato and not having sort of the communal property thing, and then he brings up, well, really he's reading Aristotle's Politics, but he sort of goes through this discussion about what to do about property, and then he presents those solutions, and then like immediately, like next sentence brings up, and so they instituted this law at Rome. And so you think, following the rest of the text, usually he says, okay, they did this at Rome, and so we should do that. And so he says, okay, they instituted this at Rome. And then he just explains immediately, without explaining any justification or anything, about how this was a total failure. And so I guess, like, it's sort of the one of the main questions I was trying to I'm thinking about is, like, what is he trying to do there? Like, one thing is, I guess you could say he's anticipating criticism, but I think what I was sort of hoping to get at was maybe to say, maybe he's doing something in addition to that, and so maybe to sort of, given that he's thinking within this framework of virtue.
Yes.
The idea being that, like, okay, he's thinking about virtue, and so he just feels that he doesn't need to sort of say that, and explain that what he saw in Rome is just that virtue failed, and so therefore, like, it's not a problem with the law, it's a problem with, like, the virtue that sort of is the necessary framework for the state. And so in that way, it sort of like supports the law that he does think, because I think he does think that is the best legal solution.
Yes.
Right? But I think he's just sort of trying to grapple with, okay, given that that's the best legal solution, how can we kind of, what else is the problem, or what else do we need to kind of do to, like, make that work, if that makes
So it
sense.
points to the fact that Patrizi believes in the preventive solutions, right? So you want to prevent vice and avarice in particular from taking over. You have to set up the state in such a way that it discourages all these things, and you can do it through education, private persuasion, but also creating an ethic, a civic ethic of work and of not living off the rents of other people, and just have those things be despised by the entire populace. People are not going to do things that their neighbors despise. But I think it's a very interesting approach, because one of the things he criticizes in the law is that, and the humanists in general criticize in the law, is that it's a curative. The law is often response to problems that have already gotten out of control. It's an attempt to control vice rather than encourage virtue. So his mentality is that we have to cut it off at the root by creating a state that has such commitment to virtue and to each other, the common good, and things like that, that there will be no, you won't need so much law. And this is also found, by the way, in Chinese theory, Chinese civic theory, that too much law, and the Romans said this too, too much law is a sign of a corrupt republic, right? Corruptissima res publica innumera leges. So if you start seeing a republic producing lots of laws, it means it has lots of vices. But you want to set up the state in this preventive way, So I think that's a very interesting point that you raised there. There's, by the way, a conference volume on the importance of work in humanist thought. And it's edited by a Hungarian scholar. I will eventually think of his name, but it's quite an interesting volume. And it even finds its way into the education of Bourbon princes in the 16th century, which you wouldn't expect Bourbon princes to be encouraged to work. All right, good. Right. Okay, does anyone have, oh yes, and the idea of wealth, that people who get wealthy fast, in particular, subiti guadagni, right, as Dante would say, they consider quick wealth to be a sign of vice. If you build up your wealth, gradually, especially through agriculture over many decades, and your family tries to build estates, that's perfectly okay. You don't want it to get out of hand. But if you start making money very quickly, something's wrong. So you probably would not approve of Silicon Valley at all. But of course, capitalism doesn't occur as a world category in the 15th century. All right, so does anyone have a question they would like to ask, address? Yeah, Patrick?
Thank you very much, Molly. It's really a fascinating talk. And I was just thinking in terms of the limitation on property ownership. Obviously, the people whose property was limited would not consider that a good thing. So they would consider that vicious. So I'm just wondering, to what extent are the good or the virtue of the individual and the good and virtue of the community aligned? And are all things that are virtuous for the community also virtuous for the individual? Or are there certain things that are perhaps neither good nor bad for the individual, but are very good, or don't have to be good or bad for the individual, but are good for the community? Or perhaps even things that feel bad or are indeed bad for certain individuals, but are good for the community?
Yeah, and I feel like that kind of just gets at like another kind of core motivating question of what we're trying to figure out is that, and that's sort of why I also thought of the Greek and Roman thing, because it sort of seems like, unless you kind of, I was sort of trying to make something out of it in a way, because it does seem like he kind of, well, at least he's also trying to make something out of it. He kind of like lands in this quagmire, essentially, of like what you're pointing to, which I think is like driven by the different ideas of the sources that he's reading. But I think he's trying to say that ideally, I don't super know. I think probably he was sort of trying, and ideally in the state, have things be good for both the community and the individual. But I think as you're pointing out, like inherent in this is that problem. That like that is the problem that essentially like what you're just asking is like the question that he's asking and trying to figure out in the text is that like with all of this there is this conflict between what's good for with property there is a problem about what is sort of good for the individual potentially and like what is, does that make sense? Is that getting what you're asking or is that not getting what you're asking?
Totally. I'm also curious, would Patrizi say that it's actually good for the individual to have that property limited? Like, would it make you a vicious person to have too much property, or is the only problem with excessive property ownership that it's bad for the community?
I think it's both that it's bad for the community and what you were just phrasing about how if you have like not even really landed wealth, but wealth that's gained through like honest hard work particularly, he's really interested in this kind of like farmer, that you're working the land, like in that sense, if you have a lot of wealth from that and it's just through sort of honest work, then that's fine. But I think what he's primarily concerned about is what you raised with sort of, usury and getting quick ways of gaining wealth. But I think also greed is like, so sort of like maybe also there's I would say like the motivating factor for gaining wealth. Like he's interested in wealth that is useful for sustaining yourself and sustaining a family. like a sort of this Aristotelian conception of like wealth versus if wealth is sort of motivated by avarice, and that's like a humanist concern, right, about avarice. So, yeah.
Yes, this is all inserted into the general ancient philosophical view of what goes back to Plato, the tripartition of the soul, reason, appetite, reason, honor-seeking, status-seeking, and appetite. So he regards people who are, whose main interest is making money as perverted people who are not paying enough, they're not measuring their activities by reason. So it's perfectly justified to want to make wealth for certain reasons. If you want to support your family, there's nothing wrong with making money for that purpose. If you want to provide resources for the state, right? If you want to be wealthy so that your state can hire better mercenary soldiers or can defend itself from other armies, that's also fine. If you want to make money to make your state more elegant and build beautiful buildings and to sponsor theatricals and poetry and art and music, that's also fine. But it's the idea that you're going to make money, making money takes over your life, and that's all you care about. The avaricious person is going to destroy the state. So he thinks, one of the things that's interesting about this is he really thinks that the state can help the individual get control of their lives. And this, I think, is something that's highly debated at the moment in modern America. You know, to the degree to, this is the attack on liberalism in a nutshell. In America, the post-liberal attack on liberalism is that liberalism gives too much independence to individuals to set their own goals. And a certain number of individuals will set themselves the goal of becoming the wealthiest person in the world, first trillionaire, as Elon Musk is going to be. And that is bad. The state should not encourage people to do that. The state should encourage people to have a proper sense of proportion, literally proportion, because of course Plato thinks is a mathematical formula for the reason controlling passions and appetites. So, and Patrizi is in this sense a Platonist, I believe, that he wants to use the state to control the appetites and the passions by changing the way people regard these things. If you have a state that worships the wealthy, like modern America, I'm sorry to say, worships the wealthy, then everything's going to go crazy. You want to have a state with the proper balance between the body and soul. Anyway, so this is very interesting talk. We're going to have to go on to Eero's talk, but happily go on to Eero's talk. Eero and I have a distant relationship because he has been my informal advisee all year through a program that's offered by George Mason University. And he is writing a dissertation, which I will let him explain in more detail, about in which Patrizi forms a chapter. So I tried to interest him in joining the Patrizi project, but I think Patrizi is a small part of it. He is let's say, spiritually a member of the Patrizi project, but I very much value what his abilities. He's also a remarkable linguist. And I very much am looking forward to hearing about this chapter. So, Eero, I will let you, I'll turn the parola, as we say in Italy, over to you. I'll turn the word over to you.
Great. So, hello, my name is Eero Arum. I am an incoming assistant professor at UT Austin, and I'm currently finishing my PhD at UC Berkeley. So before I begin, I want to apologize that I can't be with you in person today. And I also wanted to thank the organizers for accommodating me at a distance. I'm really grateful to be admitted even remotely into the company of so many distinguished Patrizi scholars. The more so as I come to this material, not as a specialist on Patrizi, but as a grateful visitor to a field you all know much better than I do. So today I want to sketch a preliminary reading of a neglected chapter in Patrizi's De Regno, Book 1, Chapter 13. This chapter's title combines mathematics, metaphysics, and politics. In English, it translates that unity presides over all numbers, and that just in the same way, the rule of one surpasses all the rest. I'll suggest that this chapter helps resolve two contested issues in the literature on Patrizi. The first is Patrizi's relationship to scholasticism, and the second is the relationship between Patrizi's two major political treatises, the De Regno and the De Institutione Republicae. So Patrizi's argument in this chapter begins from the metaphysical priority of unity. Unity is prior to multiplicity. The one is the source of all things, mathematically, cosmologically, and politically. And it follows for Patrizi that the many can act, rule, and endure only insofar as they imitate the unity of the one. From this metaphysical premise, Patrizi argues that the rule of one man is superior to the rule of many. And he illustrates this claim with examples drawn from Greek and Roman antiquity, from the Roman dictatorship and the reign of Julius Caesar to the mixed constitutions of Crete and Sparta. So what can this chapter tell us about Patrizi's political project? I want to offer three related theses. First, Patrizi reappropriates the scholastic principle of unity. And specifically, I'll show that Patrizi's argument in De Regno 113 comes directly from Aquinas's De Regno. So Patrizi reappropriates scholastic political metaphysics while, and this is very important, he dispenses with its dialectical form. Second, I'll argue that Patrizi deploys the principle of unity to defend a form of what I'll call princely republicanism. So Patrizi tests the principle of unity against Greek and Roman exempla rather than against scripture. And his historical analysis leads to a specific constitutional conclusion that the principle of unity is realized most durably not in an unmixed kingship, but in a mixed constitution with a single prince at its helm. And third, the De Regno and the De Institutione Republicae elaborate a shared constitutional vision grounded in the principle of unity. Patrizi's chapter advances a doctrine that his educated readers would have already known, what I'll call the principle of unity. The principle of unity holds that every composite whole derives its unity from a single ruling element. And this principle was a commonplace in high scholastic political thought, developed by Peter of Auvergne, Giles of Rome, and Engelbert of Admont, among others. But its locus classicus and Patrizi's most likely source is Aquinas's De Regno, written around 1271 for the king of Cyprus. Aquinas begins from a claim drawn from the first book of Aristotle's Politics. In all things ordered to one, there is some element that rules the others. And this principle for Aquinas is universal. It holds at every level of being, from the cosmos to the human body. And in the political community too, a single ruler directs the multitude. Without the directive guidance of a prince, the multitude would dissolve into its constituent elements, just like the body would dissolve without a soul. Aquinas establishes the principle of unity at De Regno, Book 1, Chapter 1. And then in Book 1, Chapter 2, he extends that principle to advance 3 arguments in favor of monarchy. I'll call the first argument the argument from approximation, the second the argument from nature, and the third the argument from experience. And we can see that Patrizi borrows each of these arguments directly. So Aquinas' argument from approximation runs as follows. Every multitude derives its unity from a single ruling element. That ruling element must itself be unified. Otherwise, it couldn't serve as a source of unity. So the many cannot rule unless they are somehow joined together into one. It is clear, Aquinas writes, that many could in no way rule a multitude if they were entirely in disagreement. A certain unity is therefore required, requiritur quaedam unio, among the many, if they are to rule in any way at all. For many could not pull a ship in one direction unless they were in some way joined together. But how? Aquinas goes on to explain that the multitude must approximate the true unity of the one. And several things are said to be unified through an approximation to the one. One, therefore, rules better than many by reason of the fact that the many are approximating the one. So the many, in short, rule only by approximating the unity that monarchy already possesses by nature. Now, Patrizi reproduces this argument in De Regno 1:13. And although he obscures the scholastic origin of his argument by citing a wide range of Greek sources, he's clearly drawing on Aquinas here. Patrizi first establishes as a general principle that unity is prior to multiplicity. Nature's own reasoning, he writes, teaches that every multitude begins from one. Patrizi then extends this principle to argue for the superiority of monarchy. Accordingly, we say that the rule of one man is far superior to the rule of many. For among many, a certain unity is required, unitas quaedam requiritur, and note the echo of Aquinas here. A certain unity is required for all deliberations, actions, and choices. Otherwise, the many cannot rule and govern well and rightly. And we see this in civil societies, which are preserved and grow only so long as they imitate that image and likeness of unity. As Patrizi puts it, it is clear that the rule of many cannot be well managed unless one person presides, who, like the helmsman of a ship, drives it to the harbor of safety against the resisting and contending winds. So Patrizi extends Aquinas' argument. The unity principle shows not only that the rule of one is preferable to the rule of the many, but also that the rule of the many is only viable when one figure presides over the multitude. Aquinas' second argument for monarchy in the De Regno is his argument from nature. He famously writes, "Furthermore, those things which are according to nature are in the best condition, for in each thing nature does what is best. Now all natural rule is from one. For in the multitude of the body's members, there is one that principally moves the rest, namely the heart. And in the parts of the soul, one power principally presides, namely reason. And among the bees, one king. And in the whole universe, one God, the maker and ruler of all. And this stands to reason, for every multitude is derived from one. Therefore, it is necessary that in a human multitude, the best condition is to be ruled by one." Again, the same argument appears in Book 1, Chapter 13 of Patrizi's De Regno. Patrizi writes, "Just as, therefore, God rules all things in the whole universe, the mind rules in the parts of the soul, and the heart or the brain rules in the multitude of the members. Since all natural governance flows from one, so too it seems fitting that in any that any gathered multitude should be presided over by one rather than by many. So note the direct parallels between Patrizi and Aquinas here. Patrizi echoes Aquinas. All natural governance flows from one, from the whole universe in universo mundo, to the parts of the soul, partibus animi, to the heart, core, to the multitude of the body's members, multitudine membrorum. Third is Aquinas' argument from experience. He argues that if we examine history, we see that this is also shown from experience. For those provinces and cities which are not ruled by one suffer from dissensions and toss about without peace. And in support of this claim, Aquinas cites several biblical passages. This is the shortest of Aquinas' three arguments for monarchy, but it's the longest section of Patrizi's chapter. Patrizi displaces Aquinas' biblical citations with lengthy analyses of Greek and Roman constitutional history. And it's here that Patrizi moves beyond Aquinas, enlisting the resources of political humanism. And this is where I'll turn in my second section. So we've just seen Patrizi reappropriate Aquinas' argument for the unity principle. Now I want to turn to my second thesis, that Patrizi's humanist rereading of the unity principle culminates in what I call princely republicanism. The Greek and Roman exempla he selects, read through the lens of the scholastic unity principle, point towards a specific constitutional conclusion. Patrizi begins his analysis with cases of constitutional emergency. He argues that in times of crisis, republics can preserve themselves only by concentrating authority in a single leader. The condition of republics in great dangers and great calamities can be preserved and saved by no other means than if they are reduced to the command of one man. So we can read this as Patrizi's humanist transposition of the scholastic reductio ad unum argument. Patrizi finds the clearest example of this principle in the Roman dictatorship. He writes, "The Romans in great dangers created a single dictator, to whose command they entrusted all things. The Romans did this because they understood that in the rule of one resides the greatest authority, free judgment, unambiguous counsels, weightier decisions in ordering affairs, and swifter and more energetic executions." But what begins as an argument about exceptional political circumstances soon becomes something more. As Patrizi's chapter proceeds, the exception becomes the rule. The civil wars between Pompey and Caesar, on Patrizi's reading, mark the point at which the Roman Republic discovered it could no longer sustain itself, even in peacetime, without the directive guidance of a single prince. Patrizi calls Cicero as a witness, citing his remark in a letter to Atticus that I would rather you tyrannestai, that is, be well tyrannized, than fight on with the best hope. Tyranny, this Greek word implies, is a thing that can be done well, and Patrizi seems to agree. Patrizi goes on to explain that the utility of reducing the affair to the judgment of one became evident once Caesar had taken control of affairs. And again, we see the traditional scholastic reductio ad unum principle being projected onto a classical exemplum. I think this puts pressure on a familiar misreading of Patrizi. Quentin Skinner has described Patrizi as denouncing Caesar with great vehemence as the destroyer of Rome's freedom. And Skinner views Patrizi's alleged opposition to Caesar as evidence that he belongs to a lineage of anti-monarchical humanist republicanism. But the text I just walked through gives us reason to think otherwise. The fact that Patrizi can make Caesar his paradigmatic virtuous prince exposes a legitimizing function of humanist virtue politics that Skinner's reading obscures. Patrizi then turns from Caesar to the mixed constitutions of Crete and Sparta. The Cretan and Spartan lawgivers, he writes, established a republic composed of the entire people, over which one king nevertheless presided, since these most prudent legislators understood that the decisions of the multitude are disordered in uncertain matters, unless directed by some one person, acting as a helmsman in adverse storms. So Patrizi shares Aquinas's metaphysical principles, but he reads them against Greek and Roman history rather than against scripture. And his historical examples converge on a specific constitutional form, a republic comprising the whole people with a single prince at its head. This finding, I'll now suggest, reframes the relationship between Patrizi's two major political treatises. So we've now seen Patrizi reappropriate Aquinas's argument and bring it to bear on Greek and Roman constitutional history. Now I'll turn to my third thesis, that once we attend to the principle of unity, we find that Patrizi's two major political treatises elaborate a shared constitutional vision. If the reading I've offered so far is correct, the principle of unity is foundational to Patrizi's constitutional thought. So we should expect to find the same principle at work, not only in the De Regno, but also in Patrizi's other major political treatise, the De Institutione Republicae. That text has traditionally been read as the De Regno's Republican counterpart. But the gulf between the two treatises has often been exaggerated. If we focus on Patrizi's use of the unity principle in both treatises, we find that they overlap in some surprising ways at the level of their constitutional theory. Now, it's true, of course, that the constitutional theory of the De Institutione Republicae is in some ways at odds with that of the De Regno. In the very first chapter of the De Institutione Republicae, Patrizi walks through the De Regno's arguments for monocratic rule, and he concludes against them, arguing in favor of a non-monarchical republic. But the general thrust of the treatise points in a rather different direction. The two treatises share a basic commitment to the principle of unity. What changes between them is the institutional locus of that unity, not the principle itself. The principle of unity is at play throughout the De Institutione Republicae, and again, by the principle of unity, I mean the principle that every composite whole derives its unity from a single ruling element. In Book 1, Chapter 1, Patrizi writes that in a well-ordered republic, citizens collected into one present themselves as one man. In Book 2, Chapter 2, he writes that every discrete essence is constituted as a unity only when its elements cohere, as if reduced into one assembly. And his examples are plebs, populace, and contio. In Book 4, Chapter 2, Patrizi writes that both the republic and a household require a presiding element. The principle of the household in the republic agrees in most respects, for just as civil society ought to have few who command and many who obey, so the household ought to have one who presides. And in Book 5, chapter 2, Patrizi applies the same analysis to the parts of the soul, characterizing reason as the principatus. So if the Patrizi of the De Institutione Republicae is committed to the principle of unity, how can he argue in favor of a mixed republican constitution? The answer is that Patrizi conceptualizes the ruling body of the optimal republic, the Senate, as a unity. In Book 3, Chapter 3, Patrizi writes that senators must come together into one like a body, which sees with many eyes, works with many hands, and is supported by many feet. So the Senate is one body, corporate entity that sees, works, and walks. And the Senate, for Patrizi, must coire in unum, come together into one. But even within this one body, there must be some presiding figure. Patrizi continues in the same chapter. The higher magistrates ought to hold the first place in the Senate, and especially he who bears the dignity and majesty of the republic. The Senate is to be summoned at their nod, and the matters that seem opportune are to be referred. So the Senate, though one body, has a single head. There's one presiding figure who summons the senators, sets their agenda, and grants them license to speak. And this magistrate, Patrizi suggests, is regal. He bears the majesty of the republic. In Book 3, Chapter 1, Patrizi writes that private citizens should regard magistrates not as their fellow citizens at all, but as princes or kings, or rather, as the numen and genius of the republic. So what we see here is that Patrizi is applying imperial cult vocabulary to a mixed republican constitution. So in the De Institutione Republicae too, Patrizi ends up favoring something like a mixed republican constitution with a princely figure at its helm. This finding opens up a new path to understanding the relationship between Patrizi's two major treatises. In both texts, Patrizi vehemently rejects the charge of inconsistency. At the opening of the De Regno, he invokes what he presents as a Platonic doctrine. There's one form of commonwealth, which will be divided in two ways. For if one man rules best, it is called kingship, but if several rule best, it is called the commonwealth of the optimates. Patrizi's suggestion is that his two treatises converge on a single constitutional form. But what is that form? Patrizi is more specific in the preface to Book 6 of the De Institutione Republicae, where he makes the same move and goes further. Patrizi takes Plato to hold that there is one form of commonwealth, though it is named in two ways. If the best man rules, it is called kingship. If several, aristocracy, the rule of the best. But then he continues, it makes no difference whether one or many rule so long as the manner of living and the best laws remain unchanged. Led by this view, the Spartans joined kingship with a republic, appointing a king who differed scarcely at all from private citizens. So here, Patrizi's preference for the one true virtuous constitutional form, a mixed republic with the presiding ruler, is modeled on Sparta. This is the same example that does the heaviest work in De Regno 113, where this constitution most fully embodies the principle of unity. So Patrizi's two defenses of his consistency converge on the same constitutional model, a mixed republican constitution where one man presides. Patrizi's preference for this constitutional model is also apparent in some of his lesser studied writings. Take the De Gerendo Magistratu of 1446, addressed to Achille Petrucci on his election as prior of Siena. Patrizi's stated aim in this treatise is to enumerate the qualities befitting a man who presides over the republic. qui republicae praeest. And throughout the treatise, he addresses his young pupil as a princeps. He advises Achille on how a princeps should win the love of the people, how a princeps should keep his secrets hidden, and how a princeps should bear himself apart from a private man. So one could almost say that this treatise is a kind of miniature mirror for princes addressed to the future prince of a mixed republic. And for Patrizi, there's nothing paradoxical about this, because the optimal republic is one that's also led by a prince. We can also look to Patrizi's De Origine et Antiquitate Urbis Senae. And let me pause to make a philological remark here. There's a long-standing debate about the proper dating of this treatise, and the currently favored view is that it was completed sometime after 1460. But we can be more specific. Near the end of the treatise, Patrizi tells us in his own voice that he's been exiled from Siena for nearly 36 years, per annos prope sex et trigenta. We know that Patrizi was exiled in July of 1457. So the De Origine et Antiquitate Urbis Senae was likely composed in 1492 or 1493 at the very end of Patrizi's life. This text closes with a striking passage. Patrizi prays that Siena will endure forever on one condition: if those who preside over the Republic, qui republicae praesunt, will preserve a concordant mind and will among themselves, and will not contend among themselves with any hatreds, rivalries, and ambitions. Now this, as we've just seen, is the same formula Patrizi reached for in the De Gerendo Magistratu, where he set out to enumerate the qualities befitting a man who presides over the Republic, qui republicae praesunt. So Patrizi's vocabulary for the head of a republic remains the same from his first political treatise to his last. And here, in his final treatise, that language is joined to the principle of unity, which Patrizi now applies to his native Republic of Siena. So let me draw these threads together. I've argued first that Patrizi's De Regno 113 follows Aquinas's De Regno 1.2 closely. Patrizi reproduces all three of Aquinas's arguments for the principle of unity in the same order and at points nearly in the same words. So Patrizi's relationship to scholasticism, at least in this chapter, isn't only one of rejection, it's also one of reappropriation. Patrizi preserves the metaphysical conclusions of scholastic political theory while replacing its dialectical form with humanist rhetorical techniques. I've argued second that Patrizi's humanist transposition of the unity principle leads him to endorse a specific constitutional form. The historical examples Patrizi selects point him towards a princely republic, a republic comprising the whole people with a single prince at its head. And I've argued finally that the same principle of unity is at work throughout Patrizi's corpus, including the De Institutione Republicae. Patrizi's two major political treatises read together are two elaborations of a single constitutional vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Eero. This is really a very thought-provoking and wonderful paper. And raised a question I don't think that has really been come up yet in the conference, which is the unity of the two treatises. I postulated something of a development of Patrizi's thought as he lived for 30 years in the Regno di Napoli, that he became at least to appreciate the monarchical form. But it seems, you believe that he is a Republican in his very broad sense of republic. And he thinks the two can be combined. I think that he's certainly striving to see the principle of unity in both forms of government. I think that one of the problems for him personally, not necessarily for us as interpreters, is how one can conceive of Republican life, Republican decision-making as proceeding from a principle of unity. In the monarchy, it's more intuitively obvious that the monarch is the final decision-maker, and he has to consult counsel. He seeks counsel. So the problem for the monarch is to have good counselors, and for those counselors to not be flatterers. And the great danger of counselors in this tradition of Mirror Princes is that your counselors will be flatterers and self-interested. So and this is the great theme, of course, of the Castiglione's court here. What I would like to ask you, a couple questions. First, in some way, the Republic has to achieve unity, and it can do this through debate, and achieve consensus through debate. And it can also do this by having temporary as opposed to permanent monarchs. Right. So that's what I would ask you to comment or elaborate on a bit more, and maybe to point this question somewhat more sharply. Does virtue guarantee unity? If you have a virtuous republic and a virtuous monarch plus counselors, will that in itself guarantee unity, or is some constitutional principle necessary to produce unity? So that's one question. And the other is, do you think that Patrizi prefers monarchical forms of council, or he still values the Aristotelian principle that, what do we say, crowdsourcing, right? That if a large assembly of Athenians meeting in the Pnyx will be able to achieve a better council because they have so many voices and so many perhaps expertises, that one, if you're trying to decide whether to go to war, there will be one member of the assembly who knows about the military capacities of the Macedonians, and be another one who knows about finance, and another one who knows about the state of the Republic's forces, and the combination of the various expertise will lead you to a better decision. And that opportunity doesn't necessarily appear in a situation where the counselors are chosen, and especially in those sorts of monarchies where people have a hereditary right to be consulted. This is one of the issues that the humanists addressed. They were against the idea that there should be hereditary counselors because there's no guarantee they're virtuous, and so they wanted to have some other way of achieving status on the King's Council than merely hereditary rights. So they wouldn't like the House of Lords, for example. They would only approve. Actually, I think this means, sadly for me, because I like the old House of Lords in England, that they would agree with Mr. Starmer that the Council of the Lords should all be based on merit and not on heredity. So I asked you these two questions. One's about whether virtue is enough to guarantee unity, and the nature of counsel, what sort of counsel what would Patrizi say about how to achieve unity in council and the best decision-making in council?
Thank you for these two questions. I think they really get to the heart of Patrizi's project and his understanding of the unity principle. In response to the first question, I think you're right that Patrizi is thinking about how a republic can achieve unity. And one thing you see in both treatises is that Patrizi is looking for a kind of substitute or imitation of monarchical unity through non-monarchical institutional forms. So you see this in his analysis of the Roman dictatorship and his analysis of emergency magistrates in Greek city-states. And you also see it in his analysis of the figure of the supreme magistrate in the De Institutione Republicae. Now, I think all of this analysis is complicated by the trajectory of his argument in De Regno 113, where he seems to favor Caesar's transformation of the dictatorship into a permanent office. So there might be some genuine tension in Patrizi's analysis here. I'm not sure it can be neatly reconciled. And in terms of the question of whether virtue guarantees unity, that's a particularly interesting question. I'm not sure that Patrizi resolves this question neatly, but it does seem that Patrizi believes that a prince needs to be supremely virtuous in order to serve a unifying function within a republic. And you see this in particular in his discussion of Julius Caesar as an exemplum throughout the De Regno. Caesar appears frequently as an exemplum when Patrizi is itemizing the virtues that a prince needs to exhibit. And I think it's partly because Caesar, in Patrizi's view, was such a virtuous figure that he was able to restore unity to Rome. The second question pertained to, oh, yeah, sorry.
So if virtue can, the usual medieval mode of taking counsel in both republics and in monarchies aimed at consensus. In other words, they really did not like to take votes. They did take votes a lot, but usually the ideal was that everyone should agree, and that would guarantee that the decision was correct. Actually, oddly enough, the first principle of voting that's built into any constitution was the choice of the Holy Roman Emperor in 1354. That was the first constitutional requirement that a vote be taken, but the ideal is consensus. So my sense is that does virtue lead to unity? That's really, I guess, the question I was asking, is virtue lead automatically to unity? If everyone's honest, if everyone is virtuous, they will come up with the same conclusion. Maybe after taking counsel in this more democratic way, but nevertheless, in the end, everyone will agree that will itself guarantee that the decision is correct. Anyway, I'm sorry. I was trying to explain a little bit more why I think that question is important. Because if you believe that there is a natural law, right, and that and divine providence, which the Stoics believed, both natural law and divine providence, you should end up with unity of belief. But of course, the modern democratic state does not believe that. It thinks that rich diversity of opinions will just be fine, and we don't need unity at all. All right. So what about the other questions I asked you, Eero?
Right. So the second question, if I remember correctly, was, do we see in Patrizi a preference for monarchical forms of council, or rather for non-monarchical forms of council, such as crowdsourcing or aristocratic council? And I think that for Patrizi, both are necessary within a well-ordered republic. I've made the case already that he emphasizes the need for a princely or quasi-monarchical office within a mixed republican constitution, but I think it's also certainly true that Patrizi favors an aristocratic council in which membership is based on merit and hereditary descent. And you see this in particular in his praise of the Venetian constitution. So I take Patrizi to be emphasizing the need for both princely and aristocratic institutional forms. And this is one element of his commitment to a mixed constitutional model.
I'm afraid that we're going to have to leave the discussion there, but thank you very much. And Eero, please send me your paper and I will send you further comments on that. I'm sorry we're not able to hear the whole discussion because we had quite an interesting group of papers. I think all were excellent papers, and we do intend to publish them. We will probably publish them in the journal of the Università di Siena, where we published last year's conference papers. I will ask you to wait for an email from Patrick, who will tell you more about the publication possibilities. We might publish there. We have, Silvia has promised to intervene. It's possible we might take it to another venue that would be more available to English-speaking readers. Well, anyway, we won't speculate on where they will be published, but we have already an offer of one place we can publish. All right, so thank you very much, everyone, for attending the conference. I hope that we can take at least one lesson from Patrizi away with us today, which is that the health and eternity of the Republic depends on human will. There is no natural cycle of republics. That doesn't need to collapse. It doesn't need to decline into tyranny. But that human beings are able to guarantee, or not guarantee, but they're able to keep the republic going only so long as they have a commitment to virtue and education. So with those words, I'll close the proceedings and invite anyone here to attend the lunch, which maybe Patrick can tell us more about the lunch. If you would like to attend the lunch. Oh, I'm forgetting this is supposed to be a gathering of the Patrizi project, so I have to immediately be unvirtuous. But if anyone deeply desires to attend the lunch, you can certainly join us, because we have more reserved places than there are people to attend. All right, well, I'll close now. Thank you.
Thank